Chapter 1. They called him the Ice King of Manhattan. Mason Rhodes, 44 years old and worth more than small countries, had built his empire on the ruins of compassion, or so the whispers went. From his corner office on the 52nd floor of Rhodes Tower, he controlled a business empire that stretched across 3 continents, and his reputation for ruthlessness preceded him like a winter chill that could freeze hearts at 20 paces. But Destiny Lewis needed this job more than she needed to listen to warnings. Standing in the gleaming lobby of Rhodes Tower at 7:30 on a Monday morning, Destiny smoothed her navy blazer with hands that had learned not to tremble. The marble floors reflected her image back at her. A 41-year-old woman with warm brown eyes that had weathered storms and emerged stronger, skin the color of rich mahogany, and a smile that could transform rooms when she wasn't calculating whether this paycheck would cover both rent and her daughter's student loan payment. Her natural hair was styled in a sophisticated twist that took 45 minutes to perfect, because first impressions mattered when you were about to work for Manhattan's most feared billionaire. The morning air still carried the conversation she'd had with her brother Devin just 12 hours earlier. His detective instincts had kicked in the moment she mentioned the job offer, and his protective tone had filled her small apartment kitchen like smoke from a fire alarm. "Destiny, I've been asking around about this guy," Devin had said, setting down his coffee mug with the deliberate care that meant serious business. "Mason Rhodes isn't just demanding, he's destructive. Word is he's burned through 15 assistants in 3 years. 15, Des. That's not high standards, that's something else entirely." She had stirred honey into her tea, watching the golden swirls disappear, much like her other job prospects had vanished over the past 6 months. "What else am I supposed to do, Dev?" The nonprofit world dried up after what happened at Community Forward. No one wants to hire someone whose last board called her too idealistic for budget management. Devin's expression had softened then, the way it always did when he remembered that his little sister carried weights he couldn't lift for her. "I just don't want to see you get hurt again. This Rhodes guy, people say he looks at employees like numbers on a spreadsheet. And when the numbers don't add up the way he wants, he fires them," Destiny had finished. "I get it. But Denisha's been looking for work for 8 months since graduation, Dev. 8 months of sending out resumes while I watch her confidence crumble a little more each day. This job pays enough for me to help her and still keep us afloat. Sometimes you have to take risks." Now, standing in the cathedral-like lobby of Rhodes Tower, Destiny wondered if taking risks was the same thing as walking blindfolded toward a cliff. The elevator that would carry her to the 50th floor gleamed like a golden chariot, or a gilded cage. As the doors slid shut with a whisper of expensive engineering, Destiny caught her reflection in the polished steel. The woman looking back at her had learned to wear armor in the form of professional clothing and carefully controlled expressions. But underneath the armor, her heart beat with the rhythm of hope and desperation dancing together. Each floor that passed took her further from the world she knew, a world of community potlucks, budget meetings in church basements, and the satisfaction of helping families find housing. Each ascending number brought her closer to something that made her pulse quicken with equal parts anticipation and dread. By the time the elevator reached the 50th floor, she felt like she'd traveled to another planet entirely. Ben Shaw, Mason's assistant, met her at the elevator with a smile that seemed genuine but carried the exhaustion of someone who'd learned to smile through workplace warfare. He was younger than she'd expected, probably early 30s, with kind eyes that reminded her of her brother's partners at the precinct, men who'd seen enough to appreciate simple kindness. "Ms. Lewis? I'm Ben Shaw. Welcome to Rhodes Enterprises." His handshake was firm but brief, and she noticed how his gaze flickered toward the corner office at the end of the hall. "I'll be training you this week, but I have to be honest, Mr. Rhodes is particular about how things run up here." As Ben led her through the executive floor, Destiny absorbed details like a detective gathering evidence. The offices were pristine to the point of sterility, all glass and steel and surfaces so clean they looked untouched by human hands. Abstract art hung on walls in perfectly measured intervals, expensive pieces that conveyed success without warmth. The air itself seemed rarefied, filtered through systems that removed not just dust but any trace of the messy humanity that existed 50 floors below. Coffee stations here, Ben explained, gesturing to a setup that looked more like a laboratory than a break room. Mr. Rhodes drinks his black, no sugar, temperature precisely 160 degrees. The thermometer's in the drawer. He knows if it's wrong. Destiny nodded, filing away the information while another part of her mind wondered what kind of person demanded their coffee heated to an exact temperature. Control freak, or someone who'd learned that controlling small things helped when everything else felt chaotic? His schedule's color-coded, Ben continued, leading her to a workstation that commanded a view of the entire floor. Red for board meetings, never interrupt unless the building's on fire. Blue for client calls, knock once, wait for permission. Green for administrative time, that's when you can approach with questions, but keep them brief. They passed a conference room where she glimpsed 3 men in expensive suits speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Through the glass walls, she caught fragments of conversation about stock prices and merger deadlines, words that represented millions of dollars changing hands with the casual ease of ordering lunch. And that, Ben said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, is Mr. Rhodes' office. Destiny followed his gaze to the corner office that dominated the entire eastern wall of the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Manhattan that probably cost more per square foot than most people's yearly salaries. But it wasn't the view that made her breath catch, it was the figure silhouetted against those windows. Even from a distance, Mason Rhodes commanded attention like gravity commands falling objects. He stood with his back to the office, hands clasped behind him, studying the city spread out below as if he were planning its conquest. The cut of his charcoal suit spoke of Italian tailoring and prices that could fund small charities. His dark hair, now touched with distinguished silver at the temples, caught the morning light in a way that suggested even his genetics had been optimized for success. "He's been in since 5:30, Ben murmured. "He's always here before anyone else and stays after we all leave. I sometimes wonder if he ever actually goes home." As if sensing their attention, Mason turned from the window. Even across the office floor, Destiny felt the weight of his gaze like a physical force. Steel-gray eyes that seemed to catalog and assess everything they encountered fixed on her for a moment that stretched longer than comfort allowed. His face could have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and classical proportions, but there was something in his expression that made her think of photographs she'd seen of soldiers returning from war. Beautiful, controlled, and carrying invisible wounds. Then he turned away, dismissing them as efficiently as he'd noticed them, and returned his attention to his city. "He'll want to meet you at 9 sharp, Ben said, checking his watch. "That gives us an hour to go over the basics." "And Ms. Lewis?" A word of advice from someone who's lasted longer than most here: don't take anything he says personally. Mr. Rhodes doesn't actually see people so much as he sees functions. You're the new executive assistant function. As long as you perform the function correctly, you'll be fine. But as Destiny settled into her new workspace, organizing files and learning software that controlled millions of dollars with the click of a button, she couldn't shake the image of Mason Rhodes standing at those windows. There had been something in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, that didn't match the Ice King reputation. Something that looked less like conquering and more like searching. The morning flew by in a whirlwind of passwords, procedures, and protocols. By 8:50, Destiny had absorbed enough information to run a small corporation and enough anxiety to power several city blocks. Her new computer screen displayed Mason's schedule for the day, a series of meetings, calls, and appointments scheduled with military precision. Every minute accounted for, every interaction planned and purposeful. At exactly 9 o'clock, Ben stood and straightened his tie. "Showtime," he said, and despite his attempt at lightness, Destiny caught the nervous energy in his movements. "Remember, brief, professional, and don't expect small talk. Mr. Rhodes doesn't do social niceties." They walked across the office floor toward the corner office, their footsteps muffled by carpet that probably cost more per yard than Destiny's monthly groceries. Through the glass walls, she could see Mason Rhodes seated behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of black marble. He was reading through documents with the focused intensity of a surgeon studying X-rays, his fingers moving across pages with surprising grace for hands that she now noticed bore the faint calluses of someone who'd once worked with them. Ben knocked once on the glass door frame. "Mr. Rhodes? Your new assistant is here." Mason looked up from his documents, and Destiny felt the full force of his attention like stepping into a spotlight. Those steel-gray eyes moved over her with an assessment that was clinical rather than personal, cataloging details with the efficiency of a computer scanner. She straightened her spine and met his gaze directly, drawing on years of non-profit board meetings where she'd learned that showing weakness invited attack. "Ms. Lewis." His voice carried the kind of authority that made people straighten chairs and check their watches. "I trust Ben has explained our expectations." "He has, Mr. Rhodes. I'm ready to begin." Something flickered across his expression, surprise, maybe, at her direct response. Most people, she imagined, probably stammered or rushed to fill silence when he spoke. But Destiny had spent years dealing with city officials and foundation directors, men who wielded power like weapons and expected deference like tribute. She'd learned that respect was earned through competence, not cowering. "Your resume indicates extensive experience in nonprofit management," Mason continued, setting down his documents with precise movements. "What makes you think those skills translate to corporate assistance?" It was a test, obviously. A way to gauge whether she'd fold under pressure or defend her qualifications. Destiny had expected this moment since accepting the position. Managing a nonprofit requires juggling multiple stakeholders with competing interests, working within tight budget constraints, and solving problems with limited resources, she replied, keeping her voice steady and professional. "I've coordinated fundraising events for 500 people, managed boards of directors with strong personalities, and maintained donor relationships worth millions of dollars. The main difference I see is that here, the stakeholders are shareholders instead of community members." Mason's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. It was the first crack in his controlled facade she'd witnessed. An interesting perspective. Most corporate executives would argue that nonprofit work lacks the rigor of business. Most corporate executives have never had to convince a room full of community activists to agree on anything, Destiny replied, allowing the smallest hint of humor into her voice. Or explain to a grieving family why budget constraints mean we can't provide services they desperately need. Nonprofit work teaches you efficiency because waste isn't just bad business, it's taking resources away from people who need them to survive. For a moment, something shifted in Mason's expression. The clinical assessment softened into something that looked almost like interest. Recognition? But before Destiny could analyze it further, the mask of professional control slipped back into place. "Ben will continue your orientation," Mason said, returning his attention to his documents. "I expect the transition to be seamless." It was clearly a dismissal, but as Destiny turned to leave, she caught him glancing up at her once more. This time, his gaze lingered on her face rather than cataloging her professional qualifications. For just a moment, she saw something in those steel-gray eyes that reminded her of her own reflection in dark windows, the careful guarding of someone who'd learned that letting people too close could lead to devastating consequences. Walking back to her desk, Destiny felt the strange sensation of having passed some kind of test she hadn't even known she was taking. Behind her, she could feel Mason's attention like warmth from a fire she wasn't sure she should approach. Every instinct her brother had tried to instill in her whispered warnings about powerful men who collected people like trophies and discarded them just as easily. But there had been something else in that brief conversation, something that made her think the warnings might not tell the whole story. When she'd mentioned families in need, she'd seen a flicker of something almost vulnerable cross his features. It was gone so quickly she might have imagined it, but Destiny had spent too many years reading people's real needs beneath their surface presentations to dismiss her instincts entirely. As she settled into her new workspace, organizing the color-coded files and learning the precise timing of Mason Rhodes' perfectly controlled world, one thought kept returning to her mind: everyone warned her not to work for the heartless billionaire. But what if the heart wasn't missing? What if it was just buried so deep that even he'd forgotten where he'd hidden it? If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. The first day ended with Destiny's head spinning from information overload and her heart carrying questions she wasn't sure she should want answered. As she gathered her purse and prepared to return to her real world of subway rides and grocery store coupons, she caught one final glimpse of Mason Rhodes through his office windows. He was back at his post, silhouetted against the city lights, hands clasped behind his back in that same searching posture she'd noticed that morning. Something about the image stayed with her all the way home, through dinner with Denisha and her brother's concerned phone call checking on her first day. Even as she fell asleep in her small apartment, Destiny couldn't shake the feeling that she'd glimpsed something important in those few moments of conversation, something that suggested the Ice King's reputation might be armor rather than nature. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests, and new opportunities to understand the man behind the carefully constructed walls. But tonight, as she drifted off to sleep, Destiny Lewis couldn't help wondering what had put those invisible wounds in Mason Rhodes' eyes, and whether someone brave enough might find a way to help them heal. Chapter 2. 2 weeks into working for Mason Rhodes, Destiny had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his mood like a meteorologist tracking storm patterns. The way he held his shoulders when quarterly reports were late. The precise angle of his pen when reviewing contracts. The almost imperceptible tightening around his eyes when board members questioned his decisions. She'd become fluent in the language of a man who communicated more through silence than most people did with words. But tonight, something was different. It was nearly 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening, and the 50th floor of Rhodes Tower had transformed from its daytime symphony of ringing phones and hurried conversations into something resembling a beautiful mausoleum. The cleaning crew moved through the offices like ghosts, their movements quiet and efficient as they restored order to the controlled chaos of corporate ambition. Most employees had fled hours ago to their lives beyond these glass walls. Dinner with families, drinks with friends, the simple pleasures of existing without quarterly earnings breathing down their necks. Destiny should have left with them. Her official hours ended at 6, and Denisha was expecting her home for their Thursday night tradition of takeout Chinese food and job search strategy sessions. But something had kept her anchored to her desk, some instinct that whispered she was needed here. Mason's office lights were still on, casting a warm glow against the gathering darkness outside. Through the glass walls, she could see him moving with restless energy, pacing from his desk to the windows and back again like a caged predator. His jacket hung abandoned over his chair, his tie loosened in a rare display of anything less than perfect control. The sleeves of his white dress shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms that reminded her he'd built his empire with his hands before he'd ruled it from boardrooms. She'd been organizing files from the Henderson acquisition, a small construction company that Rhodes Enterprises had purchased that afternoon, when she heard the sound that made her look up sharply. Mason's voice, raised in anger, carrying through the supposedly soundproof glass of his office. "I don't care what the optics look like, Williams. You fire those men tonight, and you'll be explaining to unemployment insurance why a profitable company suddenly can't afford workers who've been loyal for 15 years. Destiny's hands stilled on the documents. She'd processed the Henderson acquisition paperwork herself, knew the numbers by heart. The company was indeed profitable, not spectacularly so, but solid, steady, the kind of business that kept families fed and communities stable. The kind of business Mason's father had probably run before the corporate predators destroyed it. No, Mason's voice continued, sharp enough to cut glass. You will not implement staff reductions to boost short-term margins. Find efficiency improvements elsewhere, or I'll find someone who can think beyond next quarter's bonus structure. The line went quiet, and through the glass, Destiny watched Mason end the call with the controlled violence of a man restraining himself from throwing the phone through the window. He stood there for a moment, hands braced against his desk, head bowed like Atlas contemplating the weight of the world on his shoulders. That's when she noticed the other figure in his office. Mrs. Dorothy Banks, the night cleaning supervisor, stood near Mason's desk with her cart positioned discreetly to one side. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that held the kind of wisdom that came from watching people's truest selves emerge when they thought no one was looking. Destiny had spoken with her briefly during previous late nights. Mrs. Banks had worked at Rhodes Tower for 12 years and spoke of the building's inhabitants with the fond exasperation of someone who'd raised difficult children. But now, Mrs. Banks was speaking to Mason Rhodes with the gentle authority of someone who'd earned the right to dispense advice, and incredibly, he was listening. "Child, you can't save every company the way you couldn't save your daddies," Mrs. Banks was saying, her voice carrying the musical cadence of someone raised in Alabama cotton fields. "But you can sure enough honor his memory by treating working folks with the dignity he would have wanted for himself." Mason straightened slowly, and even from her desk, Destiny could see the way his shoulders settled as if Mrs. Banks' words had lifted some invisible burden. "He would have liked Henderson Construction," he said quietly. "Small outfit, family-owned, built quality houses for people who needed them. Everything his company used to be before those vultures picked the bones clean," Mrs. Banks finished matter-of-factly. "I know the story, honey. Known it since the day you hired me 12 years ago and told me no cleaning person in this building would ever have to worry about being laid off for budget reasons. You've been fighting your daddy's war ever since, trying to prove that power doesn't have to corrupt, that success doesn't have to come at the expense of decent folks." Mason turned toward the windows, his profile etched in sharp relief against the city lights. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm fighting a losing battle. The board expects returns, shareholders demand growth, and competitors are always looking for weaknesses to exploit. Being decent is expensive." "Being decent is the only thing that's worth the cost," Mrs. Banks replied, beginning to dust his bookshelf with movements that spoke of long familiarity with the space. "Your daddy knew that. It's why he refused to cut corners on safety equipment even when the bank was breathing down his neck. It's why he paid his workers fair wages even when the contracts were thin. And it's why you turn this building upside down every time someone suggests treating employees like line items on a balance sheet." Destiny found herself leaning forward, drawn into this unexpected glimpse behind Mason's carefully constructed facade. The man she was watching bore little resemblance to the Ice King of reputation. This was someone wrestling with moral complexity, someone whose ruthless business persona was apparently a shield protecting something much more vulnerable underneath. "The Henderson workers don't know how close they came to losing their jobs tonight," Mason said, and there was something raw in his voice that made Destiny's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Williams had the termination papers drawn up, justified it with efficiency projections and market positioning. All very logical, all perfectly legal. All perfectly heartless," Mrs. Banks observed. "Good thing their boss remembers what it feels like to watch a good man destroyed by heartless decisions." Mason was quiet for so long that Destiny wondered if the conversation was over. But then he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "He used to say that a man's character wasn't measured by how he treated his equals, but by how he treated people who couldn't fight back. Workers depending on their paychecks. Families counting on stability. People who trusted him to do right by them. Sounds like a wise man. He was. And they destroyed him anyway." The bitterness in Mason's voice was like acid eating through steel. Leveraged buyout disguised as a partnership opportunity. They stripped his company for parts, fired half the workforce, and sold the contracts to the lowest bidder. 6 months later, 3 of his workers died in a construction accident because the new company cut safety corners he never would have allowed. Mrs. Banks stopped dusting and looked at Mason with the gentle directness of someone who'd heard this story before but understood he needed to tell it again. And your daddy blamed himself. He blamed himself for being naive enough to trust handshake agreements and good faith negotiations. For believing that success in business could be built on integrity instead of exploitation. Mason's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The night before he died, he told me that honorable men finish last in a dishonorable world. That I should learn to be harder, colder, more ruthless if I wanted to survive. And you took that advice, Mrs. Banks said gently. I built an empire on it. Became everything I needed to become to ensure no one could ever destroy me the way they destroyed him. Cold, calculating, willing to make hard decisions without flinching. The Ice King they whisper about in elevators. Mason turned back toward his desk, and Destiny caught a glimpse of his expression, haunted, tired, carrying weights that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings. But every time I save a company like Henderson, every time I refuse to sacrifice workers for profit margins, I wonder if I'm honoring his memory or betraying his final lesson. Child, Mrs. Banks said, and her voice carried the kind of authority that had probably comforted generations of worried souls, your daddy's final lesson wasn't about becoming hard. It was about becoming strong enough to stay soft in a hard world. There's a difference between being ruthless and being protective. Between being cold and being careful. You built walls to keep the vultures out, not to keep your heart in. Destiny felt her breath catch as Mason's shoulders dropped slightly, as if Mrs. Banks' words had found their target. She should leave, should respect this private moment between employer and employee, between a wounded man and the grandmother figure who'd apparently been helping him heal for 12 years. But something kept her frozen in place, watching this revelation unfold like a flower blooming in fast forward. Sometimes the walls feel so thick I forget what I built them to protect, Mason admitted. Then maybe it's time to let someone remind you, Mrs. Banks suggested, returning to her dusting with the casual wisdom of someone who'd learned to deliver truth in gentle doses. Someone who understands that strength and kindness aren't mutually exclusive. Someone who's fought their own battles with integrity intact. As if summoned by Mrs. Banks' words, Mason's gaze moved beyond his office walls and found Destiny at her desk. Their eyes met through the glass, and she felt the impact like electricity jumping between live wires. Caught eavesdropping, she should have looked away, should have pretended to be absorbed in her filing. Instead, she held his gaze steadily, letting him see that she'd witnessed this moment of vulnerability and found it beautiful rather than weak. For several heartbeats, they stared at each other across the divide of glass and propriety and carefully maintained professional distance. Destiny saw recognition in his steel-gray eyes, an acknowledgement that she'd seen behind his mask and hadn't run screaming. More than that, she saw hunger, not for her body, though she sensed that awareness crackling between them like static before a storm, but for understanding. For someone who could look at his complicated morality and not demand he choose between being good and being strong. Mrs. Banks followed Mason's gaze and spotted Destiny at her desk. Instead of embarrassment at being overheard, the older woman's face creased into a knowing smile that suggested she'd orchestrated this moment with the subtle skill of a master matchmaker. Well now, Mrs. Banks said, loud enough for Destiny to hear through the glass, looks like someone else is working too late. That new assistant of yours has been staying past her hours all week, making sure everything runs smooth for you. Reminds me of someone else I know who cares more about doing right than punching time clocks. Mason's eyes never left Destiny's face as he responded. Ms. Lewis is dedicated. Dedicated, Mrs. Banks repeated with the tone of someone who could read subtext like a novel. That's one word for it. Another might be invested. Takes a special kind of person to care about work that ain't technically theirs to worry about. Destiny felt heat rise in her cheeks as both of them discussed her as if she weren't sitting 30 feet away. But she didn't move from her desk, didn't break eye contact with Mason, didn't retreat behind the professional boundaries that had kept them safely distant for 2 weeks. Something was shifting in the space between them, some recognition that the careful walls they'd both built were developing cracks that let light through. Mrs. Banks gathered her cleaning supplies with movements that seemed calculated to give them more time to stare at each other. "I'll just finish up in the conference room," she announced. "Take my time, make sure everything's perfect for tomorrow's meetings." The cleaning cart wheels squeaked softly as Mrs. Banks made her exit, leaving Mason and Destiny separated by glass walls and professional propriety but connected by something that felt dangerously like understanding. Mason moved toward his office door, and Destiny's pulse jumped as he stepped into the main office space for the first time since she'd started working there. Without his jacket and tie, with his sleeves rolled up and his carefully styled hair slightly mussed from running his fingers through it, Mason looked less like a corporate emperor and more like what he'd probably been at 16, a working-class boy who'd learned to fight for everything he wanted. The expensive clothes couldn't quite hide the fundamental strength in his build, the way he moved with the confidence of someone who'd swung hammers before he'd signed contracts. "Ms. Lewis," he said, and his voice carried a different quality than it did during business hours, rougher, more personal, as if the conversation with Mrs. Banks had stripped away some of his professional polish. "You're here late." "So are you," Destiny replied, standing from her desk but not moving closer, not yet. The air between them felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "I was finishing the Henderson files." Something flickered across Mason's expression at the mention of Henderson Construction. "You heard the call with Williams." It wasn't a question, and Destiny didn't pretend it was. "I heard you refuse to fire loyal workers for the sake of profit margins. That's not exactly the heartless corporate raider everyone warned me about." Mason moved closer, close enough that she could catch the faint scent of his cologne mixed with something more fundamental, the warm smell of skin and the subtle musk of a man who'd been working hard and thinking harder. "Everyone warned you about me?" "Everyone." Destiny's voice came out softer than she'd intended, almost breathless as she realized how tall he was when he stood this close, how his presence seemed to fill the space around them with magnetic intensity. "My brother ran background checks. Former colleagues shared horror stories. Even Ben tried to prepare me for your legendary lack of patience with human weakness. And yet you took the job anyway." Mason's steel-gray eyes searched her face as if looking for the answer to a question he hadn't asked. "Why?" The honest answer was too complicated: financial desperation, family obligations, the stubborn pride that made her refuse to give up when people said something was impossible. But standing this close to him, breathing in the warmth of his proximity and feeling the weight of his attention like sunlight after a long winter, Destiny found herself giving a different kind of truth. "Because I've learned not to trust other people's opinions about someone's character. People see what they expect to see, hear what they're prepared to hear. They called you heartless, but I've watched you work for 2 weeks. You remember every employee's name. You ask Ben about his mother's chemotherapy treatments. You approve expense reports for office supplies that most CEOs would delegate to accountants." She paused, gathering courage for complete honesty. "And tonight, I watched you choose people over profit even when no one was looking. That tells me more about who you are than 1,000 warnings about who you're supposed to be." Mason went very still, and Destiny realized she'd crossed some invisible line from professional observation into personal territory. For a moment, she wondered if she'd miscalculated, if the understanding she'd thought she saw in his eyes had been projection rather than reality. Then Mason reached out, slowly, deliberately, and touched her hand where it rested on the desk between them. His fingers were warm and slightly rough from those long-ago calluses, and the contact sent electricity racing up her arm and straight to her heart. "No one's ever defended my character to my face before," he said quietly, and there was something raw and wondering in his voice that made her think he wasn't used to being seen as anything other than a force of corporate nature. "Maybe they were too busy being intimidated to pay attention," Destiny replied, and she didn't pull her hand away from his touch even though every professional instinct screamed that this was dangerous territory. "I've spent years reading between the lines of what powerful men say versus what they do. You've built a reputation for ruthlessness, but your actions tell a different story. What story do they tell? The question came out rougher than Mason probably intended, and Destiny realized he genuinely didn't know, that somewhere along the way, he'd lost track of his own goodness and the armor he'd built to protect it. They tell the story of someone who learned early that the world can be cruel to decent people, so you made yourself strong enough to protect the decency without advertising its existence. Someone who'd rather be feared for the wrong reasons than destroyed for the right ones. Destiny turned her hand palm up beneath his, letting their fingers intertwine in a gesture that was intimate and comforting and absolutely inappropriate for a boss and employee at 8:30 on a Thursday night. But Mason didn't pull away. Instead, his thumb traced over her knuckles with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his intimidating reputation, and Destiny felt something shift between them, some acknowledgement that they'd moved beyond professional courtesy into something more dangerous and infinitely more real. "You sound like you speak from experience," Mason observed, and his voice had dropped to the kind of low, intimate tone that suggested he was seeing her not as his assistant but as a woman who might understand the weight of carrying protective armor. "I've had to learn to be harder than I wanted to be," Destiny admitted. "Single motherhood teaches you that sometimes you have to choose between being liked and being respected. Between being seen as sweet and being seen as competent. I've spent years building walls around my softness so that people would take me seriously in board meetings and budget negotiations. And does anyone ever see behind your walls?" The question was loaded with implications that had nothing to do with professional curiosity and everything to do with the way Mason was looking at her now, like she was a puzzle he desperately wanted to solve. Destiny felt her breath catch as she realized how close they'd moved to each other, how his free hand had come up to rest on the desk beside her hip, effectively caging her against the workspace in a way that should have felt threatening but instead felt protective. The scent of his cologne was stronger now, mixing with the warmth radiating from his body and creating an atmosphere that felt intimate despite the corporate setting. "Not often," she whispered, and her voice came out huskier than she'd intended. "Most people are content to deal with the armor. They don't want to handle the complications that come with seeing someone's real self." "What complications?" Mason's voice had dropped to match her whisper, and Destiny could feel the warmth of his breath against her temple as he leaned closer, drawn by some magnetic pull that seemed beyond either of their control. "The responsibility," Destiny replied, and she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs as Mason's thumb continued its gentle exploration of her hand. "When you see someone's real self, you become responsible for either protecting it or damaging it. Most people would rather maintain comfortable distance than risk that kind of responsibility." Mason went very still, and Destiny realized her words had struck something deep and vulnerable in him. When he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of careful control that meant he was fighting something powerful. "And what about you, Destiny? Are you prepared for that kind of responsibility?" The use of her first name sent heat coursing through her veins like whiskey on an empty stomach. They'd maintained strict professional boundaries for 2 weeks, never crossing the line from Mr. Rhodes and Ms. Lewis into anything more personal. But now, with her name on his lips and his touch burning through her skin, those boundaries felt as substantial as tissue paper. "I don't know," she answered honestly, and her free hand came up to rest against his chest, ostensibly to maintain distance but actually to feel the steady thunder of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "But I'm tired of pretending I don't want to find out." The admission hung between them like a bridge they could either cross or burn, and Destiny saw the exact moment when Mason made his choice. His steel-gray eyes darkened with something that was part hunger and part reverence, and he lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that was somehow more intimate than if he'd pulled her against him and claimed her mouth. "Destiny," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice now, not professional courtesy but personal prayer. "You should know that I don't do casual. I don't do simple. Everything about my life is complicated, and anyone who gets close to me becomes complicated by association. I've been complicated since the day I decided to raise a daughter alone while building a career in a world that punishes women for having families," Destiny replied, and she could see her honesty affecting him like physical touch, breaking down walls he'd probably spent decades constructing. "I'm not looking for simple, Mason. I'm looking for real." Something shifted in Mason's expression then, some final wall crumbling under the weight of her directness and the electric connection sparking between them. He released her hand only to frame her face with both of his palms, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with a reverence that made her feel precious beyond measure. "Real," he repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue. "I'd almost forgotten what that felt like." Before Destiny could respond, before she could analyze whether this was wisdom or madness, Mason lowered his head and kissed her with the controlled passion of a man who'd been denying himself something essential for far too long. His lips were warm and firm and tasted faintly of the coffee he'd been drinking all day, and when she opened for him on a soft sigh, he deepened the kiss with a hunger that made her knees weak and her heart race like she was 19 instead of 41. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than the soft kiss warranted, Mason rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes as if he was memorizing the moment. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "I know," Destiny whispered back, and she could feel the truth of it settling around them like morning mist, beautiful and transformative and impossible to ignore. From somewhere down the hall, the sound of Mrs. Banks' cleaning cart reminded them that they weren't entirely alone, that the corporate world would reassert itself come morning and demand answers for the shift in their professional relationship. But for now, in the soft light of the evening office with the city sprawling below them like a blanket of stars, Destiny Lewis and Mason Rhodes stood wrapped in the knowledge that some connections were worth the complications they created. "I should go," Destiny said, though every instinct screamed at her to stay, to explore this newfound intimacy until she understood all its implications. "You should," Mason agreed, but his hands remained framed around her face, his thumbs continuing their gentle exploration of her skin as if he couldn't quite bring himself to let her go. "Tomorrow will be complicated," she warned, though the words lacked conviction when her body was still humming from his touch. "Tomorrow is always complicated," Mason replied, and his smile was soft and real and nothing like the controlled expressions he wore during business hours. "But tonight, for the first time in years, complicated feels like possibility instead of problem." As Destiny finally gathered her purse and coat, as Mason walked her to the elevator with the old-world courtesy that suggested his harsh upbringing had still included lessons in treating women with respect, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in her universe. The warnings about the heartless billionaire seemed like stories told about a different person entirely, fairy tales designed to keep people from discovering the wounded man behind the corporate armor. The elevator doors closed between them, but Mason's eyes held hers until the very last second, and Destiny knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever happened tomorrow, whatever complications arose from crossing professional boundaries with a man who could make or break her career with a phone call, she regretted nothing about tonight. Some risks, she was learning, were worth taking. And some hearts, no matter how well armored, were worth the patience it took to reach them. Chapter 3. Friday morning arrived with the brutal efficiency of an alarm clock in a peaceful dream. Destiny stood before her bathroom mirror at 6:15, studying her reflection for any visible signs of the seismic shift that had occurred in her life less than 12 hours earlier. Her lips still tingled from Mason's kiss, her skin still remembered the reverent touch of his hands framing her face, but the woman looking back at her appeared frustratingly normal, brown eyes perhaps a shade brighter, cheeks carrying a flush that makeup couldn't quite explain, but otherwise the same composed professional who'd been riding the subway to Rhodes Tower for 3 weeks. The problem was that nothing felt the same. Her coffee tasted different, richer, more complex, as if her senses had been recalibrated by intimate contact with Mason Rhodes. The familiar weight of her blazer felt like armor she wasn't sure she needed anymore. Even her reflection seemed to be harboring secrets, carrying the knowledge of what it felt like to have Manhattan's most feared billionaire whisper her name like a prayer and kiss her like she was something precious he'd been searching for without knowing it. "Mom, you're humming," Denisha observed from the kitchen doorway, her tone carrying the amused suspicion of a daughter who'd learned to read her mother's moods like weather patterns. At 23, Denisha had inherited Destiny's warm brown eyes and her father's quick smile, but her emotional intelligence was purely her own development, sharp, intuitive, and currently focused on the unusual lightness in her mother's morning routine. "I hum sometimes," Destiny replied, though she hadn't realized she'd been doing it. Some melody had been playing in the back of her mind since she'd woken up, something soft and hopeful that matched the flutter in her chest whenever she thought about seeing Mason again. "You hum when something good happens," Denisha corrected, settling at their small kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the kind of knowing look that suggested she'd inherited her Uncle Devon's detective instincts along with everything else. "The last time you hummed during morning coffee was when I graduated college. Before that, it was when you got the community forward promotion. So what happened yesterday that has you singing unconsciously at 6 in the morning?" Destiny paused in the act of gathering her purse and keys, weighing how much truth her daughter could handle. The complete truth, that she'd kissed her billionaire boss after witnessing him defend workers' jobs and discovering the wounded man behind his ruthless reputation, seemed like information that required more coffee and possibly professional counseling to process. Work was interesting yesterday, she said finally, which was like describing a hurricane as breezy, but was all she could manage until she understood what the kiss meant for her professional future. "Interesting how?" Denisha pressed, and Destiny recognized the tone from her daughter's teenage years, persistent, affectionate, and absolutely unwilling to accept evasive answers. "Did the Ice King actually acknowledge your existence beyond color-coded scheduling?" The nickname made Destiny wince slightly, remembering how wrong the reputation was compared to the reality of Mason's gentle hands and vulnerable confessions. "People aren't always who they appear to be, honey. Sometimes the stories we tell about powerful people say more about our fears than their character." Denisha's eyebrows rose in a way that suggested she'd detected interesting subtext in her mother's philosophical observation. "That's very understanding of you. Especially for someone who spent 2 weeks complaining about his impossible standards and intimidating stare." "I wasn't complaining," Destiny protested, though she remembered distinctly describing Mason's steel-gray eyes as capable of freezing hell during their first-week debriefing sessions. "You said he looked at you like you were a quarterly report that wasn't adding up correctly," Denisha reminded her with the merciless accuracy of someone who'd been listening carefully. "Now you're defending his character and humming love songs at dawn. Either you've developed Stockholm Syndrome or something significant happened yesterday." Before Destiny could formulate a response that was both honest and appropriate for mother-daughter breakfast conversation, her phone buzzed with a text message. The name on the screen made her pulse jump like a teenager's, and she tried to control her expression as she read. "Good morning. I've been thinking about our conversation last night. We should discuss the implications when you arrive. Mr." Even his text messages sounded like business correspondence, but Destiny could read between the lines well enough to recognize uncertainty masquerading as professional courtesy. Mason Rhodes, the man who commanded corporate empires with casual authority, was nervous about seeing her this morning. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. "Mom?" Denisha's voice cut through her text-induced haze. "You're glowing. Literally glowing. What kind of conversation leaves a 41-year-old woman looking like she's been kissed by sunshine?" The accuracy of her daughter's observation was mortifying. Destiny could feel the flush spreading across her cheeks, could practically see the emotional transparency that years of single motherhood had taught her to suppress during work hours. "We talked about workplace dynamics," she said weakly, which was technically true if you considered kissing your boss a form of workplace dynamic. Denisha's tone suggested she wasn't buying the sanitized version but was willing to let her mother maintain some dignity. "Well, whatever kind of workplace dynamics you discussed, it's the first time you've looked genuinely happy about a job since Community Forward. So either continue the conversation or figure out how to bottle whatever happened yesterday, because you deserve to feel that light more often." The comment hit deeper than Denisha probably intended. Destiny realized that she had been carrying the weight of professional disappointment and financial stress for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to anticipate going to work. The thought of seeing Mason again, of navigating the new territory they'd entered together, filled her with nervous energy that was equal parts excitement and terror. 25 minutes later, Destiny stood in the elevator ascending to the 50th floor of Rhodes Tower, watching the numbers climb with the growing awareness that each floor brought her closer to a conversation that could either deepen the connection she discovered with Mason or destroy the professional relationship she desperately needed to maintain. The elevator doors opened to reveal Ben Shaw waiting with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested he'd been monitoring the situation with the dedication of a weather forecaster tracking storm systems. "Good morning, Destiny," he said, offering her one of the cups with a knowing smile that made her wonder exactly how much he'd observed during his years as Mason's assistant. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? Mr. Rhodes has been in since 5:30, which is early even for him. Also, he's wearing his navy suit instead of charcoal, which he only does when he's unsettled about something." Destiny accepted the coffee gratefully, using the moment to study Ben's expression for clues about how much he knew or suspected about the shift in office dynamics. "Unsettled how?" "Hard to say," Ben replied with the diplomatic tone of someone who'd learned to discuss his boss's moods in coded language. "He's been reorganizing his desk, which usually means he's thinking about something complex. He's also asked 3 times if you've arrived yet, which is unprecedented." The information sent butterflies dancing through Destiny's stomach. Mason Rhodes, the man who controlled billion-dollar acquisitions without visible emotion, was nervous about their reunion. The knowledge was both flattering and anxiety-inducing. "How do I look?" she asked Ben, suddenly self-conscious about every detail of her appearance. Ben studied her with the frank assessment of someone who'd become accustomed to managing delicate interpersonal situations. "You look like a woman who's discovered something important about herself. Also, you're practically glowing, which is either very good or very dangerous depending on how Mr. Rhodes handles personal complications." Before Destiny could ask what he meant by that cryptic observation, Mason's office door opened and the man himself appeared, dressed in the navy suit Ben had mentioned and looking like he'd been waiting for her arrival with the controlled impatience of a man unaccustomed to uncertainty. Their eyes met across the office space, and Destiny felt the same electric jolt she'd experienced the night before, that sense of recognition and possibility and dangerous attraction that made her forget every professional boundary she'd ever established. Mason's steel-gray gaze moved over her face with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging details, searching for signs of regret or awkwardness or any indication that the kiss had been a mistake she'd spent the night regretting. "A mess. Lewis," he said, and his voice carried the same careful formality as his text message, though she could hear the underlying tension that suggested he was working to maintain professional appearances. "Could I see you in my office?" "Of course, Mr. Rhodes." The walk across the office floor felt like crossing a minefield where every step might trigger an explosion of whispered gossip or knowing looks from colleagues. But the early hour meant most of the staff hadn't arrived yet, leaving them with the relative privacy of an office building still waking up to Friday morning ambitions. Mason stepped aside to let her enter his office, and Destiny caught the faint scent of his cologne as she passed, the same warm, masculine fragrance that had surrounded her during their kiss and now triggered a cascade of sensory memories that made her pulse quicken involuntarily. He closed the door behind them with deliberate care, then moved to his desk without quite looking at her directly. The morning light streaming through his floor-to-ceiling windows cast sharp angles across his face, emphasizing the strong line of his jaw and the way his dark hair caught silver highlights in the sunshine. He looked every inch the powerful executive, but Destiny could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he moved as if he were navigating unfamiliar territory. "About last night," Mason began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that messed the perfect styling and made him look younger, more vulnerable. "I want to be clear about my intentions." Destiny settled into the chair across from his desk, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling with nervous energy. "I'm listening." Mason studied her for a long moment, and she had the sense he was choosing his words with the same care he used for merger negotiations. "What happened between us was unexpected. I don't typically become personally involved with employees." "Typically," Destiny repeated, latching onto the qualifier that suggested this situation fell outside his normal parameters. "Never," Mason corrected, and his honesty was both thrilling and terrifying. I've built my professional life on clear boundaries and controlled variables. Personal relationships introduce complications that can compromise judgment and create conflicts of interest. Destiny felt her heart sink slightly, recognizing the tone of a man preparing to retreat behind professional walls. And you're concerned about complications? I should be, Mason admitted, moving around his desk to lean against the front edge, closer to her but still maintaining careful distance. Any rational analysis would suggest that pursuing a personal relationship with you is potentially disastrous for both of us. You need this job, and I need an assistant who can function effectively without personal feelings affecting professional performance. But? Destiny prompted, hearing the unspoken word in his tone. Mason's steel-gray eyes met hers directly, and she saw the war between logic and emotion playing out in his expression. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since you left last night. About the way you defended my character without knowing whether I deserved it. About how it felt to have someone see past the reputation to who I actually am underneath all the armor. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Destiny felt her breath catch as she realized he was offering her honesty instead of professional safety, vulnerability instead of convenient distance. I haven't stopped thinking about you either, she admitted, watching relief flicker across his features. About the way you touched me like I was something precious. About seeing you defend those workers when you thought no one was watching. About discovering that the Ice King everyone warned me about is actually a man who's learned to hide his heart to protect it from people who would use his decency against him. Mason's hands gripped the edge of his desk as if anchoring himself against the pull of her words. Destiny, I need you to understand what you'd be getting into. My life is complicated in ways that have nothing to do with business. I have enemies who would use any personal relationship as a weapon. I have family members who consider kindness a weakness and would see your background as ammunition for social warfare. I have board members who question every decision that prioritizes people over profit margins. Are you trying to warn me away? Destiny asked, studying his expression for clues about whether he wanted her to run or stay and fight for whatever was developing between them. I'm trying to be fair to you, Mason replied, and there was something raw in his voice that suggested fairness was costing him considerable effort. You deserve to know what you'd be choosing before you choose it. Destiny stood from her chair and moved closer to him, close enough to see the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent carrying responsibilities that would crush weaker men. Close enough to smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body and remember exactly how it had felt to be kissed by him with such controlled passion. Mason, she said, and she watched his expression soften at her use of his first name in the office setting. I've been managing complications my entire adult life. Single motherhood, corporate prejudice, financial instability, family expectations, professional betrayal. I'm not intimidated by the prospect of your particular brand of complexity. What I'm intimidated by is the possibility of walking away from something real because it's inconvenient or risky. Mason's hand came up to cup her cheek with the same reverent touch she remembered from the night before, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone as if he were memorizing her features. What are you saying? He asked quietly. I'm saying that I'm tired of making decisions based on fear instead of hope. I'm saying that you're worth the complications. I'm saying that I want to find out where this goes, even if it means navigating corporate politics and family drama and whatever other obstacles your world wants to throw at us. The word seemed to unlock something in Mason's carefully controlled facade. He pulled her closer, his other hand settling at the small of her back, and Destiny could feel the tension in his body as he fought between professional caution and personal desire. If we do this, he said, his voice rough with emotion, there's no going back to simple professional courtesy. Once I let myself want you completely, once I let myself believe this could work, I won't be able to pretend otherwise. Good, Destiny whispered, going up on her toes to close the distance between them. Because I'm already past the point of pretending this is just professional curiosity. Mason's mouth found hers with the hungry relief of a man who'd been holding his breath and finally remembered how to breathe. This kiss was different from the one they'd shared the night before, deeper, more urgent, carrying the weight of a decision made and boundaries crossed with full awareness of the consequences. Destiny could taste his need for her, could feel the way his hands tightened on her waist as if he were afraid she might disappear if he didn't hold her close enough. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than the kiss warranted, Mason rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. "This is going to change everything," he said. "Everything's already changed," Destiny replied, and she could feel the truth of it settling around them like morning light, beautiful and transformative and impossible to ignore. From outside the office, the sounds of the building coming to life reminded them that their private world would soon be invaded by colleagues and responsibilities and the thousand small complications that came with trying to build something personal in a professional environment. "We'll need to be careful," Mason said, though his hands remained at her waist, his thumbs tracing small circles against her hip bones that suggested being careful was going to be more challenging than either of them anticipated. "At least until we understand what this is and where it's going." "Careful how?" Destiny asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Professional behavior in public. No indication that our relationship has shifted beyond appropriate workplace boundaries. We can't give anyone ammunition to use against either of us." Destiny nodded, understanding the wisdom of his caution even as her body protested the necessity of maintaining distance when all she wanted was to explore the chemistry that crackled between them like electricity during a storm. "And privately?" she asked. Mason's smile was soft and real and nothing like the controlled expressions he wore during business hours. "Privately, I want to take you to dinner tonight. Somewhere quiet where we can talk without worrying about who might overhear. Somewhere I can tell you about my father's construction company and why saving Henderson meant more to me than you probably realized. Somewhere you can tell me about Denisha and your nonprofit work and what it was like to rebuild your life after professional betrayal." The prospect of a real date, of hours spent learning about each other without the pressure of office dynamics, sent warmth spreading through Destiny's chest like sunlight after winter. "I'd like that," she said. 7 o'clock. "I'll pick you up." Before Destiny could respond, before she could point out that having Mason Rhodes arrive at her modest apartment building in whatever expensive car he drove might compromise their need for discretion, a sharp knock on his office door interrupted the moment. They sprang apart with the guilty speed of teenagers caught kissing behind the gymnasium, Mason moving to his desk chair while Destiny smoothed her blazer and tried to look like she'd been discussing quarterly reports instead of planning intimate dinners. "Come in," Mason called, and his voice carried the authoritative tone he used during business hours, though Destiny could see the flush across his cheekbones that suggested he was fighting the same battle between professional composure and personal awareness that was making her pulse race. Ben Shaw entered with an expression that suggested he'd timed his interruption carefully, carrying a stack of contracts and wearing the diplomatic smile of someone who'd learned to navigate delicate interpersonal situations with discretion. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly sorry. The Henderson construction finalization paperwork came in early. "Williams wants to schedule a follow-up call about implementation protocols." Mason's expression hardened slightly at the mention of Williams, and Destiny remembered the conversation she'd overheard about firing loyal workers for profit margins. "Tell Williams that Henderson operates under Rhodes Enterprises policies now. Any personnel decisions go through me directly. Any cost-cutting measures that affect worker welfare get my personal approval before implementation." "I'll make that clear," Ben said, making notes on his tablet. "Also, your mother called. She wants to schedule lunch to discuss the charity gala planning committee. She was insistent about the urgency." Destiny watched Mason's jaw tighten at the mention of his mother, and she remembered his warnings about family members who would consider her background ammunition for social warfare. The charity gala sounded like exactly the kind of high society event where a relationship with his assistant would become complicated quickly. "Schedule something for next week," Mason said dismissively. "And Ben?" "Ms. Lewis and I were discussing some adjustments to the office protocols. She'll be taking on additional responsibilities that may require extended hours and closer collaboration on sensitive projects. It was a masterful piece of corporate doublespeak that created plausible cover for their increased interaction without lying outright. Ben nodded with the expression of someone who understood exactly what kind of protocols were being adjusted but was professional enough not to comment. Of course. I'll update the staff scheduling accordingly. Ben paused at the door, then turned back with a smile that was equal parts knowing and supportive. For what it's worth, Mr. Rhodes, some adjustments are worth the complications they create. After Ben left, Mason and Destiny looked at each other with the shared awareness that their secret wasn't as secret as they'd hoped, but that they had an ally in Mason's assistant who seemed genuinely invested in his personal happiness. He knows, Destiny observed. Ben's been with me for 5 years. He's learned to read the subtle signs that indicate when I'm unsettled. Mason's smile was rueful. He also knows that I've never asked for protocol adjustments to accommodate personal relationships because I've never had personal relationships that required accommodation. The reminder that she was entering uncharted territory for both of them was both thrilling and sobering. They were making up the rules as they went along, navigating a connection that had the potential to either enrich their lives immeasurably or destroy everything they'd worked to build. I should get back to work, Destiny said, though leaving his office felt like swimming against a strong current that wanted to pull her back into his arms. So should I, Mason agreed, though his eyes followed her movement toward the door with an intensity that suggested work was the last thing on his mind. But Destiny? She turned back at the sound of her name. Tonight, when I pick you up for dinner, we leave all of this behind. No office politics, no corporate strategies, no professional boundaries. Just Mason and Destiny, figuring out what we might be able to build together. The promise in his voice sent heat coursing through her veins and made her pulse quicken with anticipation for the evening ahead. But it also reminded her that they were entering territory where personal feelings and professional responsibilities would intersect in ways neither of them had fully considered. As Destiny returned to her desk and began the familiar routine of managing Mason's schedule and correspondence, she could feel the weight of curious glances from arriving colleagues and the careful way Ben monitored their interactions. The atmosphere had shifted, charged with new awareness and possibility and the delicate complexity of two people trying to honor both their professional obligations and their personal desires. By lunchtime, Destiny had fielded 6 calls about the Henderson construction integration, scheduled 2 board meetings about quarterly projections, and arranged a conference call with Rhodes Enterprises' European division. Normal work that felt anything but normal when punctuated by stolen glances through Mason's office windows and the constant awareness of his presence just 30 feet away. When Mason emerged from his office at 1 o'clock for a client lunch, he paused at her desk with the professional courtesy he'd always shown, but now Destiny could see the personal warmth in his steel-gray eyes, could feel the electric tension that sparked between them even during the most mundane professional interactions. The Henderson files need to be copied for the implementation team, he said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone appropriate for office dynamics. And please confirm my dinner reservation for tonight. Table for 2, 7:30. It was professional instruction delivered with personal undertone, and Destiny felt her cheeks warm as she realized he was using business communication to remind her of their date. Of course, Mr. Rhodes. I'll handle both items immediately. Their eyes held for a moment longer than professional courtesy required, and Destiny saw Mason's carefully controlled expression soften almost imperceptibly before he remembered where they were and restored his executive mask. As he walked toward the elevator, Destiny couldn't help but notice the way other employees responded to his presence, stepping aside respectfully, lowering their voices, treating him with the kind of deference reserved for natural forces rather than human beings. She wondered how long he'd been carrying the weight of that isolation, how many years he'd spent being feared rather than known. Tonight, she promised herself, would be different. Tonight, she would learn about the man behind the reputation, the wounded boy who'd become a protective king, the complicated human being who'd learned to hide his decency behind armor that had become so convincing even he sometimes forgot what it was protecting. As Friday afternoon wore on, as the office gradually emptied of weekend escapees and the building settled into the quiet rhythm of overtime ambition, Destiny found herself watching the clock with the nervous anticipation of a teenager preparing for her first date. Because in many ways, that's exactly what tonight would be, the first time Mason Rhodes let someone see him without the corporate armor, the first time Destiny Lewis allowed herself to want something more than financial security and professional survival. The first time either of them risked their carefully constructed walls for the possibility of something real. Chapter 4. The restaurant Mason chose for their first official date was a study in understated elegance. The kind of place where reservations were made months in advance and the waitstaff moved with the silent efficiency of well-trained diplomats. Destiny had changed clothes 3 times before settling on a burgundy dress that struck the delicate balance between professional sophistication and feminine allure, and even then she'd felt underdressed until she saw the way Mason's steel-gray eyes darkened with appreciation when he picked her up at 7 sharp. Now, 2 hours later, she was beginning to understand that the man sitting across from her bore only superficial resemblance to the corporate emperor who commanded Rhodes Tower with intimidating authority. This version of Mason Rhodes laughed at her stories about non-profit board meetings gone wrong, asked thoughtful questions about Denisha's post-graduation career struggles, and shared details about his early construction days with the kind of vulnerable honesty that suggested he rarely allowed himself such openness. "You actually worked construction until you were 24? Destiny asked, studying his hands as he gestured while telling a story about learning to read blueprints. Those calluses she'd noticed made perfect sense now, badges of honor from years spent building with his hands before he'd learned to build with money and strategy. Every summer through college, then full-time for 2 years after graduation, Mason confirmed, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the white tablecloth. I told myself it was temporary, that I was just saving money for business school applications. But the truth was, I wasn't ready to leave behind the last connection I had to my father's world. The admission carried weight that had nothing to do with career choices and everything to do with a young man processing grief and guilt in the only way he knew how. Destiny found herself leaning forward, drawn by the rare glimpse of vulnerability in someone who'd learned to weaponize strength. "What finally made you leave construction?" Mason's expression grew thoughtful, and she could see him weighing how much truth to share. "A job site accident. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough to land me in the hospital for 3 days with a concussion and some cracked ribs. As I was lying there, staring at the ceiling and thinking about how my father had spent 20 years worrying about exactly that kind of accident, I realized I was trying to honor his memory by limiting myself to his world instead of using the opportunities he'd worked to give me." "So you applied to business school. Harvard MBA, finished in 18 months instead of 2 years, graduated summa cum laude with a thesis on ethical acquisition strategies in the construction industry." Mason's smile carried a hint of the focused determination that had probably terrified his professors. "I was 26 when I made my first acquisition. A small contracting firm that was about to be destroyed by the same kind of corporate predators who'd taken down my father's company." Destiny felt something click into place, a piece of the puzzle that explained the man she'd witnessed defending Henderson construction workers with such passionate intensity. "You weren't just saving their jobs. You were saving your father's legacy. I was trying to prove that business could be conducted with honor instead of exploitation. That success didn't require abandoning decency." Mason's voice carried the weight of 18 years spent fighting that particular war. "Every acquisition, every business decision, every time I choose people over pure profit, it's all an argument with the men who destroyed him. Proof that their way isn't the only way." The waiter approached to refill their wine glasses, but Mason waved him away with the distracted gesture of a man too absorbed in conversation to notice mundane interruptions. Around them, the restaurant hummed with the quiet sophistication of Manhattan's elite dining, but Destiny felt as if they were sitting in their own private world, protected by honesty and growing intimacy from the performance requirements of public spaces. "What about you?" Mason asked, his attention focusing on her with the intensity that made her feel like the most fascinating person in any room. "Tell me about the nonprofit work. What drew you to community development?" Destiny took a sip of wine, using the moment to organize thoughts that had been scattered by 2 hours of discovering that Mason Rhodes was even more compelling in private than he was intimidating in public. I grew up watching my mother clean office buildings at night to pay for my brothers and my school clothes. She'd come home exhausted, smelling like industrial disinfectant, but she never complained because she understood that her sacrifice was investing in our futures. Mason nodded, and she could see recognition in his expression, the understanding of someone who'd also learned early that comfortable lives were built on invisible labor and quiet sacrifice. When I got to college on academic scholarships, I was surrounded by classmates who talked about poverty like it was a theoretical concept instead of a lived reality. They'd debate policy solutions over expensive coffee while I was calculating whether I could afford both textbooks and groceries that week. Destiny smiled ruefully at the memory. I started volunteering at community organizations because I wanted to do something real, something that would actually help families like mine instead of just talking about helping them. And after college? I took a job with Community Forward because they promised me I could design programs that addressed root causes instead of just managing symptoms. Housing assistance, job training, financial literacy, childcare support. Comprehensive approaches that recognize that poverty is complex and solutions need to be equally complex. Mason leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that suggested he was seeing layers of her character he hadn't fully appreciated before. But it didn't work out the way you hoped. The familiar sting of professional betrayal tightened Destiny's chest, but she'd learned to discuss the Community Forward debacle with the clinical detachment of a surgeon describing a complicated procedure. I spent 8 years building programs that actually worked. Our housing placement rate was 87%, our job training graduates had a 93% employment rate 6 months post-completion, our financial literacy program helped over 2,000 families move from survival mode to savings accounts and home ownership. Those are remarkable statistics. They were remarkable results, Destiny corrected, and she couldn't keep the pride from her voice despite the bitter ending. But remarkable results require investment, and investment requires board members who understand that social change takes time and resources. When the economy tightened and donations decreased, the board wanted quick fixes that looked good in grant applications instead of comprehensive approaches that actually solved problems. Mason's jaw tightened, and Destiny recognized the expression of someone who'd fought similar battles against short-sighted thinking disguised as fiscal responsibility. They wanted you to cut programs. They wanted me to choose which families to abandon. Housing assistance or job training. Childcare support or financial education. As if families in crisis could afford to address only one area of need at a time. The old anger flared briefly before Destiny controlled it. I presented alternative funding strategies, volunteer coordination programs, corporate partnership opportunities, every creative solution I could develop to maintain comprehensive services while managing reduced budgets. But they weren't interested in creative solutions. They were interested in numbers that made them look responsible to potential donors. Helping 50 families completely was less appealing than providing inadequate assistance to 200 families and claiming higher service statistics. Destiny traced the rim of her wine glass with one finger, the motion helping her maintain composure while discussing her professional heartbreak. The final board meeting lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of explaining why cutting services would ultimately cost more in long-term social and economic impact than maintaining comprehensive programming. 4 hours of presenting research and case studies and success stories. And they ignored everything you presented. They voted 7-3 to implement the cuts and reprimand me for idealistic inflexibility in budget management. Destiny's laugh was sharp with remembered hurt. Apparently, believing that families deserve comprehensive support instead of half measures made me unsuitable for nonprofit leadership. Mason reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the contact warm and grounding and unexpectedly comforting. Their loss, he said simply. And the community's loss. The family's loss, Destiny corrected, because that was the part that still kept her awake some nights. I left because I couldn't watch programs I'd built being dismantled in the name of efficiency. But the people those programs served didn't have the luxury of leaving. They had to survive the consequences of board decisions made by people who'd never worried about rent money or childcare costs. Mason's thumb traced gentle circles across her knuckles, and she could see something shifting in his expression, a deepening understanding that connected her experience to his own battles against systems that prioritized spreadsheets over human dignity. "Is that why you're so careful about depending on others?" he asked quietly. "Because people who claimed to share your values abandoned them when it became inconvenient?" The question hit deeper than Destiny had expected, exposing truths she rarely acknowledged even to herself. "Partially. But also because depending on someone means giving them the power to disappoint you, and I've been disappointed by enough people who promised to support me but disappeared when support became costly. Like Denisha's father." Destiny felt her breath catch, surprised by how easily Mason had identified the wound she'd learned to carry without discussing. "Among others. But yes, he's the template for why I'm careful about trusting people's promises of commitment." Mason's hand tightened on hers, and she could see something fierce and protective flash through his steel-gray eyes. "Tell me about him." It wasn't a casual request, and Destiny recognized the tone of a man who wanted to understand not just her history but the experiences that had shaped her approach to relationships. She'd spent years learning to discuss Michael Lewis with the detached precision of someone recounting ancient history instead of personal devastation, but something about Mason's focused attention made the old pain feel freshly relevant. Michael was charming, ambitious, and very good at making promises he never intended to keep. "We met in college. He was studying pre-law, I was majoring in social work, and for 2 years I believed we were building toward the same kind of life. Marriage, careers that mattered, children we'd raise together to be compassionate and responsible. What changed? I got pregnant during our senior year." Destiny's voice remained steady, but she could feel the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied memories of being 21 and terrified and desperately in love with someone who turned out to be a stranger. Michael's response was immediate and non-negotiable. Abortion, law school, corporate career track, postponing children until we were financially stable and professionally established. Mason's expression grew grim, and Destiny could see him processing the implications of Michael's ultimatum. "But you wanted the baby." "I wanted our baby. I wanted the life we'd talked about building together. I wanted him to be the man I'd fallen in love with instead of the ambitious stranger who suddenly appeared when our relationship required actual sacrifice." Destiny managed a smile that was equal parts sad and proud. "It took me about 30 seconds to realize that choosing the baby meant choosing single motherhood, because Michael wasn't capable of adjusting his plans for anyone else's needs. He abandoned you. He offered financial support in exchange for discretion regarding paternity, until he was established in his career and could afford the complications of acknowledged fatherhood." The clinical language still made Destiny's skin crawl 24 years later. As if Denisha was a business liability instead of a human being deserving of love and recognition. Mason was quiet for a long moment, and Destiny could see anger building behind his carefully controlled expression, not at her, but at the man who'd abandoned a pregnant woman and unborn child for the sake of convenience and ambition. "Where is he now?" Mason asked, and there was something dangerous in his voice that suggested he was calculating whether Michael Lewis might be within reach of corporate retaliation. "Corporate law in Chicago. Senior partner, apparently very successful, married to someone more suitable for his social and professional aspirations." Destiny shrugged with the practiced indifference of someone who'd stopped caring about her ex's life trajectory years ago. "Denisha knows who he is. I've never hidden that information from her, but she's never expressed interest in contact. She says she's had enough love from one parent that she doesn't need attention from someone who considers her existence an inconvenience. She sounds like an extraordinary young woman. She is smart, funny, compassionate, determined, everything beautiful about childhood wrapped up in an adult who's learning to navigate a complicated world with integrity intact." Destiny's voice softened with maternal pride. "She's also struggling right now, trying to find career direction that feels meaningful instead of just profitable, and I know my financial stress adds pressure to her search process." Mason lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, the gesture so tender and unexpected that Destiny felt tears threaten behind her eyes. "What are you thinking?" she asked, studying his expression for clues about how her history was affecting his perception of their developing relationship. "I'm thinking that Michael Lewis is an idiot who threw away something precious because he was too selfish to recognize its value," Mason said, and his voice carried the kind of certainty that suggested he'd never make similar mistakes. "I'm thinking that Denisha is lucky to have a mother who chose love over convenience and raised her with the security that comes from being truly wanted. And I'm thinking that your experience with someone who abandoned you when you needed him most probably makes it terrifying to trust anyone else with that kind of power." The accuracy of his analysis was both comforting and unsettling. Destiny realized that Mason understood not just her history but its implications for their relationship, the walls she'd built around her heart and the careful way she approached emotional investments that might leave her vulnerable to abandonment again. "Does that concern you?" she asked. "The fact that I come with complicated trust issues and a daughter and a history of choosing the hard path when easier options were available?" Mason released her hand only to reach across the table and frame her face with both palms, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with the reverent touch she was beginning to associate with his most honest moments. "Destiny, everything about my life is complicated. My business requires constant vigilance against people who would destroy me for sport. My family considers emotional vulnerability a weakness to be exploited. My social circle includes people who collect scandals like trophies and use them as weapons in games I refuse to play." His steel-gray eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. "What concerns me isn't your complications, it's whether you're prepared to handle mine." Before Destiny could respond, before she could assure him that she was stronger than her history of abandonment might suggest, Mason's phone buzzed with an urgency that suggested business emergency rather than social interruption. He glanced at the screen with the reluctant attention of someone unaccustomed to being disturbed during personal time. "I'm sorry," he said, and she could see genuine regret in his expression. "It's Ben. He wouldn't call unless something required immediate attention." Destiny nodded, recognizing the reality of dating someone whose business operated across multiple time zones and whose decisions affected thousands of employees. "Take it." Mason accepted the call with the controlled efficiency she recognized from their office interactions. "Ben, this better be urgent." Even from across the table, Destiny could hear the anxiety in Ben's voice, though she couldn't make out specific words. She watched Mason's expression grow increasingly grim as he listened, his free hand clenching into a fist on the tablecloth. "How long ago?" Mason asked, and there was something sharp in his voice that suggested the news was worse than mere business complications. "Are you certain about the source?" More urgent conversation from Ben's end, and Destiny saw Mason's jaw tighten with the kind of tension that preceded difficult decisions. "No," Mason said firmly. "Absolutely not. We don't negotiate with corporate blackmail, and we don't sacrifice employee welfare for public relations management. Schedule an emergency board meeting for first thing Monday morning. I want legal present, and I want contingency strategies for every possible scenario." When Mason ended the call, his expression carried the weight of someone who just received news that threatened everything he'd worked to build. Destiny felt her stomach tighten with anxiety as she recognized the shift from personal openness to corporate crisis management. "What's wrong?" she asked. Mason was quiet for a moment, and she could see him calculating how much to share, weighing her right to know against his instinct to protect her from the complications that came with his world. "Someone leaked information about the Henderson Construction acquisition to a business journalist who specializes in exposing what he calls corporate welfare disguised as ethical business practices," Mason said finally. "The article is scheduled to run Monday morning, questioning my decision to maintain Henderson's workforce when industry standards would suggest significant layoffs." Destiny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. "That doesn't sound like standard business journalism." "It's not. Someone with inside knowledge of our acquisition strategy provided specific details about projected profit margins and efficiency recommendations, information that should be confidential until the integration is complete. Mason's expression grew darker. Someone wants to damage my reputation for prioritizing workers over pure profit, and they're using Henderson as ammunition. The implications hit Destiny like a physical blow. You think someone on your board leaked the information? I think someone wants to force my hand. Create public pressure that makes maintaining Henderson's workforce politically expensive instead of just financially challenging. Mason signaled for the check with movements that suggested barely controlled frustration. They're betting that I'll choose corporate reputation over worker welfare when the stakes are high enough. As they left the restaurant, as Mason helped her into his car with the automatic courtesy that suggested old-fashioned manners learned in childhood, Destiny felt the weight of understanding settling around her like a heavy coat. This was what Mason had warned her about, the complications that came with his world, the enemies who would use any perceived weakness as a weapon, the constant warfare between doing right and maintaining power. But instead of making her want to retreat to the safety of professional boundaries, the crisis made her want to fight beside him. Because she'd watched him choose people over profit when he thought no one was looking, had seen him struggle with the moral complexity of wielding power ethically in a system designed to reward ruthlessness. "Where are we going?" she asked as Mason navigated through Manhattan traffic with the focused precision of someone who'd learned to function under pressure. "Rhodes Tower. I need to review the acquisition files, identify potential sources for the leak, and develop response strategies before Monday morning." Mason glanced at her with an expression that was part apology and part uncertainty. "I'm sorry this is cutting our evening short. I understand if you want me to take you home." Destiny studied his profile as he drove, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands gripped the steering wheel as if anchoring himself against turbulent seas. This was the moment, she realized, where she could choose safety over involvement, where she could step back from his complicated world and protect herself from the fallout that was clearly coming. Instead, she reached over and placed her hand on his thigh, feeling the muscles tense under her touch. "I'm coming with you," she said. Mason's eyes flicked to hers, and she saw surprise mixed with something that looked like relief. "Destiny, this could get ugly. If someone's targeting me professionally, anyone associated with me becomes a potential target too. Then it's a good thing I have experience handling ugly situations," Destiny replied, and she could feel her own strength rising to meet the challenge. "Besides, you said no going back to simple professional courtesy once we crossed certain lines. That works both ways, Mason. You don't get to protect me from your complications by shutting me out when things get difficult." Mason was quiet for several blocks, and Destiny could see him processing her words, weighing the relief of having support against his instinct to shield her from potential consequences. "The board meeting Monday morning is going to be brutal," he warned. "These aren't people who fight fair or respect boundaries. If they know about our relationship, they'll use it as evidence that I'm making emotional decisions instead of rational business choices." "Are you?" Destiny asked. "Making emotional decisions?" Mason pulled into the Rhodes Tower parking garage and turned off the engine before answering, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers in the dim light. "Keeping Henderson's workforce employed is the right decision regardless of my feelings for you," he said carefully. "But I won't pretend that having someone who understands why it matters doesn't make me more determined to fight for it." Destiny leaned across the console and kissed him softly, tasting the wine they'd shared and the tension he was carrying and something deeper that might have been hope despite the circumstances. "Then let's go fight for it," she said against his lips. Together. As they rode the elevator to the 50th floor, as Mason used his key card to access the building after hours, as they walked through the darkened office space that looked different and more intimate under emergency lighting, Destiny felt something settling into place between them. Not just romantic attraction or professional respect, but partnership, the kind of connection that could weather corporate storms and family pressures and all the complications that came with two strong people choosing to build something real together. Mason's office, usually pristine and controlled, had been transformed into a war room within 20 minutes. Files spread across every surface, multiple computer screens displaying acquisition documents and corporate communication records, Ben arriving with coffee and grim updates about Monday morning's media strategy. But what struck Destiny most was how naturally she fit into the crisis management process, how easily she fell into the role of strategic partner rather than protected observer. The leak came from someone with board-level access, Ben said, cross-referencing files on his laptop. That narrows it to maybe 8 people. Destiny studied the acquisition timeline, her non-profit instincts translating to corporate strategy. What if this isn't about making you choose? What if someone wants to prove ethical leadership is financially impossible? Mason's attention sharpened. Explain. Henderson is a test case. If they can make even Mason Rhodes sacrifice workers under pressure, they undermine every argument for putting people over pure profit. She moved to the window, pieces clicking together. With 3 more acquisitions coming, this could destroy the entire model. Then we don't just defend Henderson, Mason said, joining her. We make it our showcase for why ethical practices create lasting competitive advantage. Mason was quiet for a long moment, and Destiny could see him calculating implications and strategies with the focused intensity that had built his empire from nothing. Then we don't just weather this storm, he said finally. We use it to demonstrate that ethical business practices aren't just morally superior, they're strategically superior. We make Henderson Construction a showcase for what's possible when you choose long-term sustainability over short-term profit maximization. As they worked through the night, developing response strategies and contingency plans and media talking points that could weather whatever Monday morning brought, Destiny felt the last of her professional walls dissolving. This wasn't just about supporting Mason through a crisis, this was about fighting for principles they both believed in, about proving that success and integrity could coexist even in systems designed to reward ruthlessness. When dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Destiny and Mason stood together at his office windows, exhausted but determined, surrounded by the evidence of hours spent building strategy and trust in equal measure. We're going to win this, Destiny said, and she could feel the certainty of it settling into her bones. We are, Mason agreed, and his arm around her waist felt like partnership and promise and the beginning of something that could weather any storm corporate warfare might throw at them. What moments in your own life have taught you that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most meaningful rewards? Have you ever found yourself defending someone whose character others had misjudged? Share your experiences in the comments below. I love hearing how these stories connect with your own journeys of discovering unexpected strength and love. Outside the windows, Manhattan was waking up to Monday morning possibilities, and inside Rhodes Tower, 2 people who'd learned to armor their hearts were discovering that sometimes the strongest protection came not from walls but from having someone worth fighting beside. Chapter 5. Monday morning arrived with the relentless precision of a corporate takeover, and by 8:30, Rhodes Tower buzzed with the kind of controlled energy that preceded either triumph or catastrophe. Destiny had barely slept over the weekend, her mind cycling between the intimate revelations of Friday night's dinner and the strategic implications of the media attack that had transformed their romantic evening into a corporate war room. Now, sitting at her desk and watching Mason prepare for what Ben had grimly termed the most important board meeting of his career, she felt the weight of being both personally invested and professionally vulnerable in ways that made her pulse race with anxiety and determination in equal measure. The leaked article had hit business news websites at precisely 6 a.m., timed for maximum impact during Monday morning market analysis. The headline, Rhodes Enterprises, Ethical Leadership or Corporate Welfare? Was surgical in its destruction, questioning Mason's decision to maintain Henderson Construction's workforce when industry best practices clearly indicate redundancy optimization opportunities. The journalist had access to confidential financial projections, internal efficiency recommendations, and acquisition timeline details that should have been restricted to perhaps 12 people in the entire company. Someone with insider access wanted Mason destroyed, and they'd chosen worker welfare as their weapon. The board members started arriving 20 minutes ago, Ben reported, his voice carrying the tension of someone who'd spent the weekend fielding phone calls from angry investors and concerned shareholders. Williams flew in from Chicago specifically for this meeting. Patterson cancelled his European conference to attend virtually. And Mrs. Rhodes. Ben paused, his expression suggesting he was choosing words carefully. Mrs. Rhodes arrived with what she described as additional context about family reputation management. Destiny felt her stomach tighten at the mention of Mason's mother. Based on his warnings about family members who would see her background as ammunition for social warfare, Madeline Rhodes' presence at this particular meeting felt ominous rather than supportive. Any word from legal about identifying the source of the leak? Destiny asked, though she could see from Ben's expression that the news wasn't encouraging. They've narrowed it to 8 potential sources, all with legitimate access to the confidential acquisition files. But proving who actually contacted the journalist. Ben shrugged helplessly. Without direct evidence, it's just suspicion and corporate paranoia. Through Mason's office windows, Destiny could see him reviewing presentation materials with the focused intensity of a general preparing for battle. He'd arrived at 6 a.m. wearing his charcoal suit, what Ben had identified as his intimidation armor, and spent 2 hours refining strategy documents and legal talking points. But Destiny could see the tension in his shoulders, could read the careful control in his movements that suggested he was fighting something more complex than mere business pressure. At exactly 9 o'clock, the conference room began filling with figures who represented decades of corporate power and enough combined wealth to fund small nations. Destiny watched through the glass walls as men and women in expensive suits took their seats around the mahogany table, their expressions ranging from concern to calculating to openly hostile. These were people accustomed to wielding influence without opposition, accustomed to board meetings where dissent was managed and outcomes were predetermined. Today would be different. Mason entered the conference room last, and Destiny felt her breath catch at the transformation that occurred the moment he stepped into the corporate arena. Gone was the vulnerable man who'd shared stories about his father's construction company, replaced by someone who radiated the kind of controlled authority that had built empires and destroyed competitors. His steel-gray eyes swept the room with calculated assessment, and she could see him cataloging allies and enemies with the precision of a battlefield strategist. But at the head of the table sat a woman who commanded attention through presence rather than intimidation. Madeline Rhodes, at 68, possessed the kind of elegant severity that suggested generations of blue blood breeding and social warfare expertise. Her silver hair was styled in a way that probably cost more than Destiny's monthly rent, her Chanel suit fit with the precision that came from personal tailoring, and her pale blue eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who'd spent decades maneuvering through Manhattan's elite social circles. When she looked at Mason, Destiny saw something that made her chest tighten with protective instinct. Love, certainly, but the complicated kind that came wrapped in expectations and conditions and the subtle cruelty of someone who'd learned to use affection as a tool for control. The media attention regarding Henderson Construction presents significant concerns about corporate reputation management. Madeline began without preamble, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested she'd been running board meetings since before some of the other members had learned to read financial statements. When business decisions appear to prioritize sentiment over strategy, it creates questions about leadership judgment that affect investor confidence across all holdings. Mason's expression remained controlled, but Destiny could see the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested his mother's opening salvo had hit its intended target. The Henderson acquisition was thoroughly analyzed from both financial and strategic perspectives. Maintaining their workforce isn't sentiment, it's sustainable business practice that ensures continued productivity and community relationship management. Community relationships, repeated board member Williams with the tone of someone who'd discovered something distasteful on his shoe. Since when does Rhodes Enterprises factor community opinion into acquisition strategy? Our shareholders expect profit maximization, not social welfare programming. Destiny felt her hands clench into fists as she watched the meeting unfold through the conference room's glass walls. She couldn't hear the specific words being exchanged, but body language told the story clearly enough. Williams leaning forward aggressively, 2 other board members nodding in agreement. Madeline Rhodes speaking with the kind of measured authority that suggested she was delivering prepared remarks rather than spontaneous observations. And Mason, isolated at the head of the table, defending principles that were apparently under coordinated attack. Ms. Lewis? Destiny turned to find Paige Graham standing beside her desk, and the sight sent alarm bells ringing through her nervous system. Paige was everything the rumors had suggested, strikingly beautiful in the way that came from excellent genetics and expensive maintenance, impeccably dressed in a way that suggested effortless sophistication, and radiating the kind of confident sexuality that probably made most men forget their own names. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves to her shoulders, her blue eyes held intelligent calculation beneath flirtatious surfaces, and her smile suggested she knew secrets that could be either delightful or devastating depending on her mood. "Mess. Graham," Destiny replied, standing to meet the other woman's gaze directly. "I wasn't expecting to see you this morning." "Emergency board meetings tend to draw interested parties," Paige said, her voice carrying the kind of honeyed smoothness that suggested she'd perfected the art of sounding harmless while being anything but. "I wanted to introduce myself properly, since we'll probably be working together quite closely in the coming weeks." The comment carried implications that made Destiny's pulse quicken with something that wasn't quite fear but was definitely wariness. "Working together how?" Paige's smile widened, and Destiny caught a glimpse of something predatory beneath the polished exterior. "Well, depending on how this morning's meeting resolves, Mason may need additional strategic support for reputation management and stakeholder relations. My firm specializes in crisis communications for high-profile executives facing challenging circumstances." The delicate pause before challenging circumstances felt like a verbal blade sliding between ribs. Destiny realized she was being warned, in the most sophisticated way possible, that Paige Graham represented a threat to both Mason's professional stability and their developing personal relationship. "I'm sure Mr. Rhodes appreciates having multiple options for strategic support," Destiny replied carefully, drawing on years of nonprofit board meetings where she'd learned to navigate political landmines disguised as helpful suggestions. "Oh, I'm sure he does. Mason has always been thorough about exploring all available options before making important decisions." Paige's tone carried intimate familiarity that suggested she'd been one of those options in the not-too-distant past. "Though I have to say, I'm surprised by some of his recent choices. The Henderson acquisition, for instance. Very unlike his usual approach to efficiency optimization." Destiny felt heat rise in her chest at the implication that Mason's ethical business decisions were somehow aberrant behavior requiring explanation. "Perhaps his usual approach is more complex than external observers realize." "Perhaps," Paige agreed, though her tone suggested she wasn't convinced. "Or perhaps recent influences have affected his judgment in ways that concern people who care about his long-term success." The comment was surgical in its precision, identifying Destiny as the influence, while maintaining plausible deniability about any direct accusations. Destiny realized she was being professionally threatened by someone who'd had years to perfect the art of corporate manipulation. "Ms. Graham," Destiny said, keeping her voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, "I think you may have misunderstood my role here. I'm Mr. Rhodes' executive assistant, not his strategic advisor. His business decisions are based on factors far beyond my input or influence." "Of course," Paige replied, but her eyes glittered with amusement that suggested she wasn't buying the professional boundaries explanation. "Though I have noticed that Mason has been different lately. More accessible. More willing to discuss alternative approaches to traditional business practices. Some might call it growth. Others might call it distraction." Before Destiny could formulate a response that would defend Mason without revealing the personal nature of their relationship, the conference room erupted in raised voices that carried through the supposedly soundproof glass. Every head on the executive floor turned toward the meeting, where the polite veneer of corporate courtesy had apparently dissolved into something resembling actual conflict. Through the glass walls, Destiny could see Mason standing at the head of the table, his posture radiating controlled authority despite being outnumbered by hostile board members. Williams was gesturing aggressively, his face red with what appeared to be genuine anger. Two other board members were speaking simultaneously, their body language suggesting they were tag-teaming some kind of coordinated attack. And Madeline Rhodes sat perfectly composed, watching the chaos with the satisfied expression of someone whose chess pieces were moving according to plan. "Oh my," Paige murmured, though her tone carried excitement rather than concern. "It looks like Mason is facing some serious opposition to his philosophical approach to business management." Destiny felt protective fury rise in her chest like a tide, threatening to sweep away years of professional diplomatic training. Perhaps the opposition is discovering that principled leadership requires more courage than they're comfortable displaying. Paige's eyebrows rose with what might have been genuine surprise or calculated admiration. "That's very loyal of you. Though I hope you understand that loyalty to a losing cause is often indistinguishable from professional suicide." The threat was delivered with such silky politeness that it took Destiny a moment to process its implications. Paige Graham wasn't just warning her about Mason's professional difficulties, she was suggesting that supporting him might destroy Destiny's own career prospects. "Ms. Graham," Destiny said, drawing on reserves of strength she developed during years of fighting for families who couldn't fight for themselves, "I've spent my entire career supporting causes that required more courage than convenience. If you think the prospect of professional difficulty is going to make me abandon someone whose character I respect, you've seriously misunderstood what motivates me." For the first time since the conversation began, Paige's polished facade cracked slightly, revealing something that looked like genuine surprise beneath the corporate manipulation tactics. "How refreshing," Paige said finally. "It's been quite some time since I've encountered someone who chooses principle over pragmatism. I hope you understand that such choices often come with consequences that extend beyond the person making them." Before Destiny could ask what that cryptic warning meant, the conference room door opened and Mason emerged, his expression carrying the controlled fury of someone who just weathered a coordinated attack and was calculating his next moves. His steel-gray eyes found Destiny immediately, and she saw relief flicker across his features when he realized she was still there, still choosing to stand with him despite whatever corporate warfare had just unfolded. But then his gaze shifted to Paige Graham, and Destiny watched his expression transform into something harder, more guarded, as if he'd just discovered an additional complication he'd hoped to avoid. "Paige," he said, and his voice carried professional courtesy wrapped around something that might have been warning. "I wasn't expecting to see you this morning. Emergency board meetings create opportunities for strategic consultation," Paige replied, moving closer to Mason with the fluid grace of someone comfortable in corporate power dynamics. "I wanted to offer my firm's services for reputation management, given the challenging media attention you're facing." Mason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Destiny realized that Paige's presence represented more than just professional consultation. It was a reminder of relationships and obligations that predated his connection to Destiny and might complicate his ability to choose personal happiness over corporate survival. "That won't be necessary," Mason said firmly. "We're handling the situation internally." "Are you?" Paige's question carried gentle skepticism that suggested she'd been monitoring the board meeting more closely than her casual presence implied. "Because from what I could observe, it appeared that internal handling might not be sufficient for the scope of opposition you're facing." Destiny felt the conversation shifting into territory that was both professional and deeply personal, where business strategy and romantic history intersected in ways that could determine not just Mason's corporate future but the viability of their developing relationship. "Paige," Mason said, and his tone carried final authority that suggested the conversation was over whether she accepted it or not. "I appreciate your concern, but my strategic decisions, both business and personal, are not subject to external consultation." The emphasis on personal was subtle but unmistakable, and Destiny saw Paige's expression sharpen with something that looked like wounded pride mixed with calculating intelligence. "Of course," Paige replied smoothly. "Though I hope you'll remember that some strategic decisions affect more than just the person making them. Board members talk, Mason. Investors share concerns. And when corporate leadership appears to be influenced by personal considerations rather than business fundamentals, it creates vulnerabilities that competitors are quick to exploit. The warning was delivered with such polished professionalism that it took Destiny a moment to realize she'd just been identified as a personal consideration that was potentially damaging Mason's corporate reputation. The implication stung not because it was delivered by someone who obviously had history with Mason, but because it contained enough truth to be genuinely threatening. My business decisions are based on comprehensive analysis of financial, strategic, and ethical factors, Mason replied, and Destiny could hear steel beneath his controlled tone. Personal considerations, as you call them, include understanding that sustainable business practices require treating employees as valuable assets rather than disposable resources. How admirably principled, Paige said, though her tone suggested she found principles less admirable than inconvenient. I hope the board shares your perspective on the relationship between ethics and profitability. As if summoned by her words, the conference room door opened again and board members began filing out, their expressions ranging from frustrated to calculating to openly hostile. Williams brushed past Mason without acknowledgement, his face still red with anger. Two other members followed with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested they were avoiding taking sides until the political wind direction became clearer. But it was Madeline Rhodes who commanded attention as she emerged last, moving with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to having rooms rearrange themselves around her presence. Her pale blue eyes swept over the scene, Mason's defensive posture, Paige's calculating smile, Destiny's carefully composed expression, with the K. Mason, she said, and her voice carried the kind of authority that suggested she expected immediate attention regardless of whatever else might be happening. We need to discuss the implications of this morning's meeting for both corporate strategy and family reputation management. The word family was delivered with emphasis that made it clear Madeline Rhodes had opinions about her son's recent choices that extended well beyond business considerations. Mother, Mason replied, and Destiny could hear years of complicated history compressed into the single word. I believe we've covered the relevant strategic considerations adequately. Have we? Madeline's gaze shifted to Destiny with the kind of assessment that suggested she was cataloging details for future use. Because it seems to me that several factors relevant to recent corporate decisions haven't been thoroughly examined. The conversation was taking place in coded language that everyone present understood but no one was willing to speak directly. Madeline Rhodes was questioning her son's judgment while identifying Destiny as a potential source of that questionable judgment. Paige Graham was positioning herself as a solution to problems that Destiny's presence had supposedly created. And Mason was caught between protecting the woman he cared about and managing corporate relationships that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars. Mrs. Rhodes, Destiny said, stepping forward with the kind of controlled courage she'd learned during years of advocating for families facing bureaucratic hostility, I hope you understand that Mr. Rhodes' business decisions reflect his own values and strategic analysis. Any suggestion that external influences are compromising his judgment does a disservice to his intelligence and leadership capabilities. The intervention was calculated to shift focus from her relationship with Mason to his competence as a corporate leader, but Destiny could see from Madeline's expression that the older woman recognized the defensive maneuver for what it was. Ms. Lewis, Madeline replied, and her voice carried the kind of polite venom that suggested decades of experience in social warfare, I'm sure you understand that family members who've invested 44 years in someone's success have perspectives on their decision-making that might not be immediately apparent to newer influences. The pause before newer influences was surgical in its precision, identifying Destiny as someone whose opinions carried less weight than Madeline's maternal authority while simultaneously questioning her motives for being involved in corporate discussions. Mother, Mason said, and there was warning in his voice that suggested he'd reached the limit of his tolerance for veiled attacks on Destiny's character or presence. Destiny has been instrumental in developing strategic responses to this morning's media crisis. Her insights into stakeholder management and community relations have been invaluable. It was a masterful piece of corporate deflection that repositioned Destiny as a strategic asset rather than a personal distraction, but Destiny could see that Madeline Rhodes wasn't convinced by the professional framing. How fortunate that you found such comprehensive strategic support so quickly, Madeline said, though her tone suggested she found the timing suspicious rather than fortunate. I hope you'll also consider more established forms of strategic consultation when corporate reputation is at stake. Her gaze shifted meaningfully to Paige Graham, and Destiny realized that Mason's mother and his former whatever Paige had been, were coordinating some kind of intervention designed to separate him from her influence. I appreciate all the strategic support being offered, Mason said, and his voice carried the kind of final authority that suggested the conversation was over regardless of how many people wanted to continue it. But my corporate decisions, and personal decisions, are not subject to committee review. The distinction between corporate and personal was deliberate and unmistakable, and Destiny felt something warm and protective settle in her chest at Mason's willingness to defend their relationship publicly despite the obvious professional costs. But as Madeline Rhodes and Paige Graham exchanged glances that suggested they were far from finished with their intervention efforts, and as the hostile energy from the board meeting continued to crackle through the office atmosphere, Destiny realized that Monday morning had drawn battle lines that would affect not just Mason's corporate future but their ability to build something lasting together. The war for Mason Rhodes' soul, and his empire, had officially begun, and Destiny was no longer just an observer but a primary target in a conflict that would test everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the price of standing up for what you believed in. As the executive floor gradually returned to its normal rhythm of ringing phones and urgent meetings, as Madeline and Paige made their strategic exits with promises to continue the conversation soon, Mason caught Destiny's hand and squeezed it with gentle pressure that conveyed more than words could have managed. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, and she could see genuine concern in his steel-gray eyes, concern not for his corporate standing or board relationships, but for her emotional well-being after being subjected to sophisticated forms of social and professional warfare. "I'm fine," Destiny replied, and she realized she meant it. The attacks had been painful and the threats had been real, but she'd weathered them without breaking, without retreating, without abandoning the man who'd chosen to stand with her despite the costs. "The question is whether you're okay with the complications this is going to create." Mason's smile was soft and real and completely at odds with the corporate battlefield they just navigated. "Destiny, complications are just problems that haven't been solved yet. And I've spent my entire career solving problems that other people considered impossible." As he pulled her closer, as she felt the solid warmth of his presence and the steady strength of someone who'd learned to fight for what mattered, Destiny realized that some battles were worth whatever scars they left behind. Because some things, love, integrity, the chance to build something real with someone who understood both your strength and your scars, were worth fighting for regardless of who lined up in opposition. Chapter 6. The penthouse elevator rose through Rhodes Tower with the smooth precision of Swiss engineering, carrying Destiny toward a confrontation with her own courage that she hadn't seen coming. It was nearly midnight on Tuesday, 24 hours after the brutal board meeting that had drawn battle lines through Mason's corporate empire, and the crisis that had begun with a leaked article had metastasized into something that threatened everything he'd spent 18 years building. The emergency that had summoned her from her apartment at 11:30 came in the form of a text message that made her blood run cold. "Crisis escalating. Need your strategic insight. Penthouse. Please come. M." In the 18 hours since Monday morning's corporate warfare, the situation had deteriorated with the relentless efficiency of a controlled demolition. 3 major investors had called emergency meetings to reassess portfolio allocation strategies. 2 board members had submitted formal requests for leadership review committees. The business press had picked up the Henderson construction story with the enthusiasm of sharks detecting blood in corporate waters. And through it all, Mason had maintained the controlled facade of a man accustomed to weathering storms, even as Destiny watched the isolation and pressure carve new lines around his steel-gray eyes. Now, standing in the elevator that would carry her to his private sanctuary, Destiny felt the weight of everything they'd risked by choosing each other over convenience. Her reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman who'd learned to armor herself in professional clothing and carefully controlled expressions, but underneath the protective layers, her heart hammered with the recognition that tonight would either strengthen the connection they'd been building or reveal that some obstacles were too large for love to overcome. The elevator doors opened directly into Mason's penthouse, and Destiny stepped into a space that seemed designed to showcase the isolation that came with absolute power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Manhattan's glittering landscape, expensive art-adorned walls that probably cost more to heat than most people's annual salaries, and furniture that looked like it belonged in architectural magazines rather than homes where humans actually lived. But what struck her most forcefully was how empty it felt, not just of people, but of personality, as if Mason had built himself a beautiful fortress that protected him from human connection as effectively as it protected him from corporate enemies. She found him standing at the windows overlooking the city, still wearing his charcoal suit despite the late hour, his posture carrying the weight of someone who'd learned to bear impossible burdens without allowing them to break him. His dark hair was mussed from running his fingers through it, his tie hung loosened around his neck, and his expensive clothes couldn't quite hide the fundamental exhaustion of a man who'd been fighting battles on multiple fronts without respite. "Mason?" Destiny called softly, not wanting to startle him out of whatever strategic calculations were occupying his mind. He turned at the sound of her voice, and the relief that flooded his expression was so profound that Destiny felt her breath catch. For just a moment, the corporate armor cracked enough to reveal the man underneath, vulnerable, exhausted, carrying wounds that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings and everything to do with the human cost of wielding power ethically in a system designed to reward ruthlessness. "You came," he said, and his voice carried the rough quality of someone who'd been speaking in boardrooms and conference calls all day without allowing himself the luxury of emotional expression. "I wasn't sure. After everything that happened today, I thought you might decide the complications weren't worth the risks." Destiny moved toward him with the deliberate care of someone approaching a wounded animal, recognizing that whatever had happened in the hours since she'd left the office had pushed Mason to some kind of breaking point that required gentleness rather than strategic analysis. "What happened?" she asked, studying his expression for clues about the crisis that had summoned her to his private sanctuary at midnight. Mason turned back toward the windows, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture she'd learned to associate with his most difficult decisions. "Williams called an emergency investor meeting for tomorrow morning. He's proposing a vote of no confidence in my leadership, with specific reference to recent decisions that prioritize personal sentiment over shareholder value." The words hit Destiny like physical blows, each one carrying implications that threatened not just Mason's corporate empire but their ability to build something lasting together. A vote of no confidence would remove him from operational control of the company he'd built from nothing, would validate every accusation that his ethical approach to business was incompatible with corporate success. "What evidence is he using?" Destiny asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The Henderson Construction acquisition is Exhibit A, maintaining workforce despite efficiency recommendations that could improve profit margins by 12%. But that's just the beginning." Mason's reflection in the window looked like a man calculating the cost of principles in a world that punished integrity. "Someone provided Williams with detailed financial projections showing how my sentimental business practices have cost shareholders an estimated $43 million over the past 2 years. $43 million in what context?" Destiny moved to stand beside him at the windows, close enough to offer support without crowding him while he processed the implications of coordinated betrayal. "Salary continuation for employees during transition periods. Enhanced severance packages beyond industry standards. Investment in worker safety measures that exceed regulatory requirements. Profit-sharing programs that distribute success instead of concentrating it." Mason's voice carried bitter pride as he listed the decisions that were apparently being used as evidence of his unsuitability for leadership. "Every choice I've made to treat employees as human beings instead of disposable resources, quantified and presented as evidence of poor judgment." Destiny felt anger rise in her chest like a tide, threatening to sweep away years of professional diplomatic training. "They're using your decency as a weapon against you." "They're using basic math," Mason replied, and there was something defeated in his tone that made Destiny realize the attacks had found their target in ways that went beyond corporate politics. $43 million is real money that could have been distributed to investors or reinvested in expansion opportunities. "Williams isn't wrong about the financial impact of my choices, he's just wrong about whether those choices represent poor leadership or moral leadership. And the board is questioning which interpretation is correct. The board is questioning whether a CEO who prioritizes worker welfare over pure profit maximization is suitable for managing a publicly traded corporation." Mason's hands tightened behind his back, and Destiny could see the tension radiating through his shoulders as he fought something that looked like despair. "They're questioning whether someone who makes business decisions based on ethical considerations instead of purely financial analysis can be trusted with shareholder investments." The weight of the accusation settled around them like smoke from a distant fire, invisible but increasingly suffocating. Destiny realized that the corporate warfare had evolved beyond simple business disagreements into something that challenged the fundamental compatibility between Mason's values and his role as a corporate leader. "There's more," Mason said quietly, and his reflection in the window looked like someone preparing to deliver news that would change everything. "Williams has documentation suggesting my personal relationship has compromised my business judgment." Destiny's blood ran cold. "They've been watching us. Someone with access to both board meetings and our private interactions has been building a case that my feelings for you influenced corporate decisions." Mason's controlled fury was barely contained. "They've weaponized our relationship against everything I've built." The sophisticated cruelty took her breath away. "Paige. She's had access to strategy sessions and witnessed our moments. Perfect position to create a narrative that love equals weakness." His steel-gray eyes held pain and determination in equal measure. "They're not just attacking my leadership, they're attacking the idea that ethical executives can have authentic relationships. Paige has consulting relationships with 3 of our board members. She's been in and out of strategy meetings for the past month, ostensibly providing crisis communication advice for other client situations. She's had access to confidential acquisition documents, timeline analyses, and financial projections." Mason's voice carried the flat quality of someone reciting evidence that indicted someone he'd once trusted. "She's also been present for several of our personal interactions, including yesterday morning's conversation about strategic support and reputation management." "So what happens tomorrow?" Destiny asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Tomorrow, I defend 18 years of ethical business practices against accusations that kindness is incompatible with corporate leadership. I argue that treating employees as valuable assets instead of disposable resources is strategically sound instead of sentimentally misguided. And I prove that my personal relationship with you has enhanced rather than compromised my ability to make decisions that benefit all stakeholders instead of just shareholders." The weight of responsibility settled on Destiny's shoulders like a lead blanket. Mason's entire empire, the livelihoods of thousands of employees, the future of ethical business practices in an industry that rewarded ruthlessness, all of it potentially hanging in the balance because he'd chosen to love her and she'd chosen to love him back. "Mason," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, "maybe Williams is right. Maybe I am a distraction that's compromising your judgment. Maybe your feelings for me are making you take risks that—" "Stop." Mason's voice cut through her self-doubt with the authority of someone who'd spent decades making decisions under pressure. "Don't let them do this to you. Don't let them convince you that our relationship is a weakness instead of a strength, that caring about someone is a liability instead of an asset." He moved toward her with the focused intensity she'd learned to associate with his most important decisions, his hands coming up to frame her face with the gentle reverence that never failed to make her feel precious beyond measure. "Destiny, you haven't compromised my judgment, you've clarified it. You've reminded me why I started building this company in the first place, why ethical business practices matter more than pure profit maximization. You've shown me what it looks like to fight for principles even when fighting is difficult, to choose integrity over convenience regardless of the personal cost. Tears threatened behind Destiny's eyes as she realized the depth of his conviction, the way he'd connected their relationship to his fundamental values instead of seeing it as separate from or competitive with his professional responsibilities. But if defending our relationship costs you everything you've built, then I'll build something new, Mason interrupted, and his voice carried the kind of certainty that had probably convinced investors to trust him with billions of dollars. Something that doesn't require me to choose between being successful and being human. Something that proves ethical leadership and profitable business practices aren't mutually exclusive. Before Destiny could respond, before she could point out the practical impossibilities of rebuilding corporate empires from scratch, Mason's phone buzzed with the urgent insistence of crisis management. He glanced at the screen with the reluctant attention of someone who'd been fielding emergency calls for 18 hours straight. "It's Ben," he said, and Destiny could see the exhaustion in his expression as he processed whatever message had arrived. 3 more investors have called emergency meetings. The stock price dropped 4% in after-hours trading. And Mason's expression grew darker as he continued reading. Someone leaked details of tomorrow's vote of no confidence to the business press. The story will break at 6 a.m. with quotes from concerned board members about leadership stability and corporate governance. The systematic destruction of Mason's reputation was proceeding with the methodical efficiency of a military campaign. Someone had orchestrated attacks on multiple fronts: board pressure, investor concerns, media attention, and personal character assassination, designed to make his position untenable regardless of the actual merits of his leadership. They're not just trying to remove you from operational control, Destiny realized. They're trying to destroy your credibility completely so you can't rebuild somewhere else. They're trying to prove that ethical leadership is incompatible with corporate success, using me as an example of why kindness is a liability in business. Mason set his phone aside with movements that suggested he was too exhausted to continue fighting battles on multiple fronts. If they succeed, it sends a message to every executive who's ever considered prioritizing employee welfare over pure profit maximization. Destiny felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest as she realized the broader implications of the attack on Mason's leadership. This wasn't just about one man's corporate empire, it was about whether ethical business practices could survive in a system designed to reward ruthlessness. "Then we don't let them succeed," she said, moving closer to Mason until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body and see the silver flecks in his steel-gray eyes. "We prove that ethical leadership isn't just morally superior, it's strategically superior. We show that companies led by people who understand the connection between employee welfare and long-term sustainability outperform companies that prioritize short-term profit maximization." Mason's hands found her waist, pulling her closer until they were standing in the kind of intimate proximity that made strategic thinking difficult and emotional connection inevitable. "How do we prove that when the evidence suggests otherwise?" he asked, and there was something raw in his voice that suggested he desperately wanted to believe her but couldn't see past the immediate crisis threatening everything he'd built. "We prove it by demonstrating that the Henderson Construction acquisition will be more profitable long-term because you maintained their workforce instead of gutting it for immediate cost savings. We prove it by showing that companies with strong employee retention and satisfaction metrics consistently outperform companies with high turnover and low morale. We prove it by making the business case for human decency." Mason's expression shifted as he processed her words, and Destiny could see something like hope beginning to replace the despair that had been weighing him down since the crisis began. "You're talking about reframing the entire argument," he said slowly. "Instead of defending ethical decisions as costly but necessary, presenting them as profitable strategies that happen to be ethical. I'm talking about proving that your father was right about honorable business practices, and the men who destroyed him were not just morally wrong but strategically stupid." Destiny reached up to trace the line of his jaw, feeling the tension in his muscles and the slight roughness of stubble that suggested he'd been too preoccupied with crisis management to maintain his usual grooming standards. "I'm talking about using tomorrow's meeting to demonstrate that ethical leadership isn't a weakness, it's a competitive advantage that your opponents are too short-sighted to recognize. Mason closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, and Destiny could feel some of the weight lifting from his shoulders as he allowed himself to consider the possibility that the attacks on his character might actually provide an opportunity to prove the superiority of his approach to business. It would require comprehensive data analysis, comparative performance metrics, and financial projections that demonstrate long-term profitability of ethical business practices, he said, and his voice carried the focused energy of someone who'd found a strategy worth fighting for. Then we spend the night building that case, Destiny replied, and she could feel her own energy rising to meet the challenge. We turn tomorrow's character assassination attempt into a masterclass on why ethical leadership is the future of sustainable business. Mason opened his eyes and looked at her with an expression that was part gratitude, part admiration, and part something deeper that made her pulse quicken with anticipation and desire. "You realize what this means?" he asked quietly. "If we're going to build a case for ethical leadership as competitive advantage, you can't be just my executive assistant anymore. You'll be my strategic partner, my co-presenter, the person standing beside me when I argue that our relationship has enhanced rather than compromised my business judgment." The implications of his words settled around them like morning light, beautiful and transformative and impossible to ignore. Mason wasn't just asking her to help him prepare for tomorrow's meeting, he was asking her to step fully into his world, to claim her place as an equal partner in both his personal and professional life. "Are you prepared for that kind of visibility?" he continued, his hands tightening on her waist as he searched her expression for any sign of hesitation or fear. "Because once you stand with me tomorrow, once you help me present the case for ethical leadership, you'll be a target for everyone who benefits from maintaining the status quo of corporate ruthlessness." Destiny felt something settle into place in her chest, some final piece of courage that had been building since the moment she'd first defended his character to his face. She'd spent years fighting for families who couldn't fight for themselves, years advocating for comprehensive solutions to complex problems, years proving that principled approaches could achieve better results than expedient shortcuts. Tomorrow, she would fight for the man she loved and the principles they both believed in. "Mason," she said, going up on her toes to eliminate the distance between them, "I've been preparing for this fight my entire career. I just didn't know the battlefield would be a corporate boardroom instead of a non-profit conference room." Mason's mouth found hers with the hungry relief of someone who'd been holding his breath and finally remembered how to breathe. This kiss was different from their previous moments of connection. Deeper, more urgent, carrying the weight of decisions made and boundaries crossed with full awareness of the consequences. Destiny could taste his need for her, could feel the way his hands moved over her body with the reverent desperation of someone who discovered something precious in the midst of losing everything else. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than the kiss warranted, Mason rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. "I love you," he said, and the words carried the weight of confession and commitment and the kind of vulnerability that powerful men rarely allowed themselves to express. "I love your courage, your intelligence, your refusal to compromise your principles for convenience. I love the way you see through corporate politics to human truth, the way you make me remember why integrity matters more than victory." Destiny felt tears threaten behind her eyes as she realized the depth of his feelings, the way he'd connected their relationship to his fundamental values instead of seeing it as separate from his professional identity. "I love you too," she whispered back, and her voice carried years of careful self-protection dissolving in the face of complete emotional surrender. "I love your hidden kindness, your willingness to fight for people who can't fight for themselves, your refusal to choose between being successful and being decent. I love that you've spent 18 years proving that power doesn't have to corrupt, that success doesn't require abandoning compassion." Mason's hands moved to the buttons of her blazer with movements that were both urgent and reverent, as if he were unwrapping something precious that he'd been waiting his entire life to discover. Destiny felt her breath catch as she realized they were crossing the final line between professional courtesy and personal intimacy, moving into territory where emotional vulnerability would be matched by physical surrender. "Are you sure?" Mason asked, his hands stilling on her clothing as he searched her expression for any sign of hesitation or doubt. "Because once we do this, once we're completely intimate, there's no going back to careful professional boundaries. You'll be mine, and I'll be yours, regardless of what tomorrow's meeting brings." In response, Destiny reached up and loosened his tie with movements that were deliberately slow and seductive, letting the expensive silk slide through her fingers as she held his gaze with unwavering certainty. "I've been yours since the night I found you defending Henderson's workers when you thought no one was watching," she said softly. "I've been yours since you chose to trust me with your vulnerabilities instead of hiding behind corporate armor. Tomorrow, we'll prove to the world that love enhances strength instead of compromising it. But tonight..." She let the tie fall to the floor and began working on the buttons of his shirt, her fingers tracing the warm skin revealed beneath expensive cotton. "Tonight, I want to show you what it feels like to be completely known by someone who loves every complicated, ethical, impossibly principled part of who you are." Mason's response was a sound somewhere between prayer and possession as he lifted her into his arms with the easy strength of someone who'd built his empire with his hands before he'd ruled it with his mind. He carried her toward the bedroom with movements that were both urgent and careful, as if she were something infinitely precious that he'd been entrusted to protect. The bedroom was as elegantly impersonal as the rest of the penthouse, all expensive furniture and tasteful art that looked like it belonged in magazines rather than spaces where humans actually lived. But as Mason set her down beside the king-sized bed, as he framed her face with hands that trembled slightly with restrained desire, the room transformed into something intimate and sacred, a sanctuary where two people who'd learned to armor their hearts could finally risk complete vulnerability. "Destiny," Mason said, and her name on his lips sounded like a promise and a prayer and the beginning of something that would either heal them or destroy them both. "I want you to know that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever the board decides or the media reports or the investors demand, this moment is real. What we have together is real. And it's worth fighting for regardless of the cost." Instead of responding with words, Destiny reached up and began unbuttoning his shirt with movements that were deliberately slow and reverent, her fingers tracing patterns on the warm skin revealed beneath expensive cotton. She could feel the steady thunder of his heartbeat, could see the way his breathing changed as she explored the geography of his chest and shoulders with touch that was both curious and possessive. Mason's hands found the zipper of her dress, and Destiny felt her breath catch as the fabric whispered to the floor, leaving her standing before him in silk underwear that suddenly felt like both armor and invitation. His steel-gray eyes moved over her body with an appreciation that was reverent rather than merely sexual, as if he were memorizing every curve and shadow for safekeeping. "You're beautiful," he said quietly, and his voice carried the kind of wonder that suggested he couldn't quite believe she was real, couldn't quite accept that someone like her had chosen someone like him despite all the complications and consequences. "So are you," Destiny replied, and she meant it in ways that went beyond physical attraction to encompass the strength and vulnerability and complex morality that made him unlike anyone she'd ever known. "Inside and out, Mason. You're beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with expensive suits and everything to do with the heart you've spent so many years protecting behind corporate armor." Mason's mouth found hers again, and this time the kiss carried the urgency of people who'd spent too long denying themselves something essential. His hands moved over her body with growing confidence, mapping territories that belonged to him now by right of mutual surrender, and Destiny felt herself dissolving into sensation and emotion that was too complex for rational analysis. When they came together on sheets that cost more than her monthly rent, when Mason's body covered hers with the careful strength of someone who'd learned to wield power responsibly, Destiny understood for the first time why people wrote poetry about physical love. Because this wasn't just about desire or attraction or the simple pleasure of human connection, this was about two damaged people healing each other through the vulnerable act of complete trust. Mason moved within her with rhythm that spoke of patience and reverence and the kind of controlled passion that came from someone who'd learned to balance strength with gentleness. His hands tangled in her hair, his mouth found the sensitive places along her throat and collarbone, and his whispered words of love and need and promise created soundtrack for surrender that made her feel cherished beyond measure. When release claimed them both, when their bodies moved together in perfect synchronization toward satisfaction that was as much emotional as physical, Destiny understood why people spent lifetimes searching for this kind of connection. Because this was love made manifest in touch and taste, and the fundamental recognition that two people could create something together that was larger and more meaningful than either could achieve alone. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in expensive sheets with the Manhattan skyline glittering beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, as Mason's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder and her head rested in the hollow of his throat where she could feel his heartbeat gradually returning to normal, Destiny felt something settling into place that had nothing to do with physical satisfaction and everything to do with emotional completion. "No regrets?" Mason asked quietly, and she could hear uncertainty beneath his post-intimate contentment, the fear of someone who'd learned that things he treasured could be destroyed by forces beyond his control. "No regrets," Destiny confirmed, pressing a soft kiss to the spot where his pulse beat steady and strong beneath warm skin. "Only gratitude that we found each other, and determination to prove tomorrow that love enhances judgment instead of compromising it." Mason's arms tightened around her, and she could feel something settling in him too, some final piece of armor dissolving in the face of complete acceptance and unconditional support. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said into the darkness, "whatever the board decides or the media reports or the consequences we have to face, I want you to know that loving you has made me a better man and a better leader. You haven't compromised my judgment, you've reminded me what I'm fighting for." As they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, as the crisis that would determine their future waited for dawn to transform possibility into reality, Destiny felt the peaceful certainty that came from knowing she'd found someone worth fighting beside. Tomorrow would bring battles that could destroy everything they'd built together. But tonight, wrapped in expensive sheets and more expensive love, they had proven that some connections were strong enough to weather whatever storms corporate warfare could create. Some things, integrity, courage, and the love between two people who'd learned to trust each other with their most vulnerable truths, were worth fighting for regardless of the odds against success. Chapter 7. Wednesday morning arrived with the soft precision of expensive window treatments filtering Manhattan sunlight, and Destiny woke to the unfamiliar sensation of Egyptian cotton sheets and the even more unfamiliar sensation of Mason's arm around her waist. For a moment, suspended between sleep and consciousness, she allowed herself to exist in the peaceful bubble of intimate contentment, warm skin against warm skin, the steady rhythm of his breathing against her hair, the absolute rightness of being held by someone who'd seen her vulnerabilities and chosen to protect rather than exploit them. Then reality reasserted itself with the brutal efficiency of a corporate takeover, and she remembered that in 3 hours, Mason would face a vote of no confidence that could destroy everything he'd spent 18 years building. "Good morning," Mason's voice carried the rough quality of recent sleep and something deeper that might have been wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real, couldn't quite accept that the night before had been more than an elaborate dream conjured by crisis-induced exhaustion. Destiny turned in his arms until she could see his face, noting how the morning light caught the silver at his temples and softened the sharp angles that made him so intimidating in corporate settings. Without his armor of expensive suits and controlled expressions, he looked younger, more approachable, like the working-class boy who'd learned to swing hammers before he'd learned to swing corporate weight. "Good morning," she replied, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with fingers that remembered the texture of his skin, the way he'd responded to her touch with reverent hunger that made her feel precious beyond measure. "How are you feeling about today?" Mason's steel-gray eyes held hers with the kind of intensity that suggested he was cataloging details for safekeeping, the way her hair spread across his pillows, the soft flush of her skin in the morning light, the absolute trust in her expression that told him she hadn't changed her mind about standing beside him regardless of the consequences. "Honestly? For the first time since this crisis began, I feel like I have something worth fighting for that's more important than corporate reputation or shareholder approval." His hand found hers beneath the expensive sheets, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of people who'd crossed every barrier between professional courtesy and personal intimacy. "I feel like whatever happens in that boardroom, I've already won something more valuable than they can take away." The sentiment was beautiful and romantic and completely at odds with the practical reality of what they faced in the next few hours. Destiny felt her chest tighten with the recognition that love, no matter how profound or transformative, couldn't protect them from the consequences of choosing each other in a world that punished such choices. "Mason," she said carefully, studying his expression for signs that the intimate connection they'd shared had affected his judgment in ways that his opponents could exploit. You know that what happened between us last night, as beautiful as it was, can't change the strategic realities we're facing today. Something flickered across Mason's features, surprise, maybe, that she was thinking strategically instead of basking in post-intimate contentment. But rather than looking disappointed by her practical focus, his expression showed something that looked like admiration for her ability to balance emotional satisfaction with professional awareness. "You're worried that I'm making decisions based on how I feel about you instead of what's best for the company," he said, and his voice carried understanding rather than defensiveness. "I'm worried that your opponents will use our relationship as evidence that you're prioritizing personal happiness over corporate responsibility," Destiny replied, and she hated that she had to voice concerns that felt like betraying the intimacy they'd shared. "I'm worried that loving me is going to cost you everything you've worked to build." Mason released her hand only to frame her face with both palms, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with the gentle reverence that never failed to make her feel cherished. "Destiny, listen to me carefully. What happened between us last night didn't compromise my judgment, it clarified it. You didn't distract me from my principles, you reminded me what I'm fighting to protect." His steel-gray eyes held hers with unwavering certainty. "I'm not going into that boardroom as a man whose personal feelings have clouded his business sense. I'm going in as someone who's finally remembered that business success without human connection is just elaborate bookkeeping." Before Destiny could respond, before she could point out that noble sentiments might not be enough to overcome coordinated corporate warfare, Mason's phone buzzed with the insistent rhythm of crisis management. He glanced at the screen with the reluctant attention of someone who'd learned that emergency calls at 7 a.m. rarely brought good news. "It's Ben," he said, and Destiny could see tension creeping back into his expression as the corporate world reasserted its claim on his attention. "The investors' meeting has been moved up to 9:30. Williams wants to resolve the leadership question before market opening." The acceleration of the timeline sent anxiety shooting through Destiny's nervous system like electricity through water. Less time to prepare, less time to build their case for ethical leadership as competitive advantage, less time to transform what should have been Mason's character assassination into a demonstration of why principled business practices were strategically superior to ruthless alternatives. "That's not much time to prepare our presentation," she said, already calculating how long it would take to organize the comparative data and financial projections they discussed the night before. "Our presentation?" Mason's eyebrows rose with something that looked like surprise mixed with hope. "You're still planning to stand with me in there?" The question revealed insecurities that his confident exterior had hidden, the fear that morning light and practical considerations might have changed her mind about supporting him through the crisis that could destroy his corporate empire. "Mason, we spent most of last night building a strategic argument for why ethical leadership is a competitive advantage instead of a costly sentiment. Did you think I was going to let you present that case alone?" Destiny sat up in bed, pulling the sheet around herself with movements that were unconsciously graceful, and Mason's gaze followed the line of her bare shoulders with appreciation that was both aesthetic and possessive. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you remember to emphasize the Henderson Construction long-term profitability projections instead of getting distracted by defending your personal character." Mason's smile was soft and real and completely at odds with the corporate battlefield they were about to enter. "You realize that standing beside me in that boardroom will make you a target for everyone who benefits from maintaining status quo business practices?" "I've been a target since the moment I chose to work for the supposed heartless billionaire instead of listening to everyone's warnings," Destiny replied, and she could feel her own strength rising to meet the challenge ahead. "The only difference is that now I'm choosing to be a target for someone whose character I respect and whose principles I share." An hour later, they stood in Mason's penthouse bathroom, sharing sink space and morning routines with the kind of intimate domestic coordination that usually took couples months to develop. Destiny watched Mason shave with the precise movements of someone preparing for battle, noting how he transformed from vulnerable lover into corporate warrior with each step of his grooming ritual. The expensive suit, the carefully styled hair, the controlled expressions, all armor designed to project authority and competence in environments where weakness was punished without mercy. But she could see traces of the man she'd held in her arms just hours before, the way his eyes softened when they met hers in the mirror, the gentle touch when he moved around her to reach his cologne, the protective instinct that made him position himself between her and any potential threats even in the safety of his own bathroom. Nervous? She asked, applying makeup with movements that were automatically professional despite the circumstances that had brought her to his mirror. Terrified, Mason admitted, and his honesty was both surprising and reassuring. Not of losing the company. I've always known that was a possibility when you choose principles over pure profit. But terrified of disappointing the people who depend on me for their livelihoods. Terrified of proving my father wrong about the possibility of conducting business with honor. Destiny set down her lipstick and turned to face him directly, studying the man who'd learned to carry impossible burdens without allowing them to break his fundamental decency. Your father would be proud of what you've built, she said quietly. Not just the financial success, but the way you've used that success to protect people who can't protect themselves. The way you've refused to sacrifice your values for convenience or profit margins. How can you be so certain? Because I've seen what you do when you think no one's watching. I've seen you defend workers' jobs when it would be easier to implement layoffs. I've seen you treat cleaning staff with the same respect you show board members. I've seen you choose the hard right over the easy wrong repeatedly, even when it costs you personally. Destiny reached up to straighten his tie with movements that were both practical and affectionate. Your father raised a man who understands that character is measured by how you treat people who can't fight back. That's not something to be ashamed of, that's something to be proud of. Mason caught her hands and pressed them flat against his chest, over his heart that beat steady and strong beneath expensive cotton and carefully constructed armor. I love you, he said simply, and the words carried weight that had nothing to do with romantic sentiment and everything to do with the recognition that she'd become essential to his understanding of who he wanted to be in the world. I love you too, Destiny replied, and she meant it in ways that encompassed not just personal affection but professional respect and the kind of partnership that could weather whatever corporate storms their opponents threw at them. The elevator ride down to the 50th floor felt like descending into a war zone where the weapons were quarterly reports and the casualties were measured in human dignity rather than physical wounds. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, Destiny could feel the charged atmosphere that preceded either triumph or catastrophe, urgent conversations conducted in hushed tones, the careful choreography of people positioning themselves for whatever outcome the morning would bring. Ben Shaw met them at the elevator with coffee and an expression that suggested he'd been monitoring developments with the dedication of a crisis management specialist. The good news is that Henderson Construction's workforce productivity metrics are exceeding projections by 18%, he reported, handing Mason a tablet loaded with performance data. The bad news is that Williams has convinced 3 additional board members to attend the meeting virtually, and Paige Graham is here as a strategic communication consultant for concerned investors. Destiny felt her stomach clench at the mention of Paige's presence. The woman who'd orchestrated the character assassination campaign would be present to witness its culmination, ready to provide damage control if Mason managed to defend himself effectively or to capitalize on his destruction if the vote of no confidence succeeded. Any word on media coverage? Mason asked, scrolling through the performance data with the focused attention of someone preparing to defend 18 years of principled business decisions. Business news networks are planning live coverage of the investor meeting outcome. The Henderson Construction story has been picked up by 3 national publications, and... Ben paused, his expression suggesting he was about to deliver particularly unwelcome information. Your mother called. She wants to attend the meeting as a concerned family member with significant emotional investment in corporate stability. The mention of Madeline Road sent tension crackling through the air like static electricity before a storm. Destiny remembered the sophisticated cruelty of their previous encounter, the way Mason's mother had wielded maternal authority like a weapon designed to separate him from influences she deemed unsuitable. Absolutely not, Mason said firmly. This is a business meeting about corporate governance, not a family intervention about my personal choices. She seemed to think the two were related, Ben replied diplomatically. Something about ensuring that board members understood the full context of recent leadership decisions. Destiny realized that Madeline Rhodes planned to weaponize her maternal concern, using the meeting as an opportunity to publicly question her son's judgment while positioning herself as someone who understood him better than anyone else in the room. She's going to argue that your relationship with me represents a pattern of emotional decision-making that compromises your corporate leadership, Destiny said, voicing the strategy that was becoming obvious the more she thought about Madeline's motivations. Probably, Mason agreed, and his voice carried the grim acceptance of someone who'd learned to expect betrayal from people who claimed to love him. But her opinion about my personal life is irrelevant to my qualifications for corporate leadership. It's relevant if she can convince board members that personal instability translates to professional unreliability, Ben pointed out. Family dynamics carry weight in boardroom politics, especially when they support existing concerns about judgment and decision-making. As they walked toward the conference room where Mason's professional future would be decided, Destiny felt the weight of being simultaneously essential to his happiness and potentially destructive to his success. Every person who saw them together would be calculating whether their relationship represented strength or weakness, whether love had enhanced his judgment or compromised it. The conference room had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with board members arranged around the mahogany table like judges preparing to deliver verdict on 18 years of ethical business practices. William sat at the opposite end from Mason's usual position, his expression carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed victory was inevitable. Paige Graham occupied a chair along the wall, ostensibly present as a consultant but positioned to observe the proceedings with the attention of someone who'd orchestrated the trial. And at the far end of the table sat Madeline Rhodes, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than most people's cars and an expression that suggested she was prepared to sacrifice her son's happiness for what she considered his own good. "Mason," she said as he entered the room, and her voice carried the kind of maternal authority that suggested she expected immediate deference regardless of the professional setting. "I hope you understand that everything I'm about to say comes from a place of love and concern for your long-term well-being." Mason took his seat at the head of the table with movements that projected confidence despite the hostile environment, and Destiny moved to stand beside him. Not behind him like a subordinate, but next to him like an equal partner in whatever battle was about to unfold. "Mother," Mason replied, and his voice carried professional courtesy wrapped around something that might have been disappointment. "I hope you understand that my business decisions are based on comprehensive analysis of strategic factors, not emotional impulses requiring family intervention." Williams cleared his throat with the theatrical authority of someone who'd been waiting for his moment to seize control of the narrative. "That's precisely what we're here to determine," he said, opening a folder thick with documentation that Destiny recognized as the evidence Paige had assembled. "Whether recent corporate decisions represent strategic analysis or emotional compromise. Whether Rhodes Enterprises is being led by a CEO focused on shareholder value or someone whose judgment has been influenced by personal considerations. The battle for Mason Rhodes' corporate empire and his right to love someone without professional penalty was about to begin." Destiny felt her hand brush against Mason's beneath the conference table, a gesture of support and solidarity that no one else could see but that reminded both of them that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds against success. Today, they would prove that ethical leadership and personal happiness weren't mutually exclusive. Today, they would demonstrate that love enhanced strength instead of compromising it. Today, they would show the corporate world that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. Chapter 8. The boardroom fell silent with the oppressive weight of a courtroom where the verdict would determine not just one man's fate, but the future of ethical business practices in an industry that rewarded ruthlessness. Mason Rhodes sat at the head of the mahogany table that had witnessed 18 years of principled decisions, facing a panel of board members whose expressions ranged from sympathetic to calculating to openly hostile. The morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows cast sharp shadows across expensive suits and carefully controlled faces, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a tribunal than a corporate meeting. Williams opened his folder with theatrical precision, his movements designed to project authority and righteousness as he prepared to present evidence that would either vindicate or destroy the man who'd built Rhodes Enterprises from construction site ambitions into corporate empire. "Ladies and gentlemen," Williams began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who'd practiced this moment, "we're here to address serious concerns about leadership decisions that appear to prioritize personal sentiment over shareholder value. The evidence we'll review today demonstrates a pattern of judgment compromised by emotional considerations that have cost investors significant returns." Destiny felt her pulse quicken as she stood beside Mason's chair, acutely aware that every person in the room was calculating her role in the drama about to unfold. She could feel Paige Graham's satisfied gaze from her position along the wall, could sense Madeline Rhodes' disapproving assessment from the far end of the table, could practically hear the whispered judgments about whether her presence represented strength or weakness in Mason's corporate leadership. "The Henderson Construction acquisition serves as Exhibit A," Williams continued, consulting documents that Destiny recognized as the confidential financial projections someone had leaked to create this crisis. Industry standard efficiency protocols would have recommended workforce reduction of 37%, generating cost savings of $4.2 million annually. Instead, Mr. Rhodes chose to maintain full employment, citing what he termed sustainable business practices and community relationship management. Williams paused, allowing the financial implications to settle around the room like smoke from a distant fire. Board members shifted in their seats, and Destiny could see the calculations happening behind carefully neutral expressions, calculations that weighed human dignity against quarterly earnings with the cold precision of corporate mathematics. "The result," Williams continued, "is an acquisition that will take 18 months longer to achieve projected profitability, with reduced returns that represent a direct cost to every shareholder invested in Rhodes Enterprises' success." Mason remained perfectly still throughout Williams' opening salvo, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the presentation materials with the controlled attention of someone who'd learned to weather attacks without revealing vulnerability. But Destiny could see the tension in his shoulders, could feel the weight of defending 18 years of principled decisions against accusations that kindness was incompatible with corporate leadership. "However," Williams said, and his tone carried the satisfaction of someone approaching his most devastating evidence, "the Henderson Construction decision represents only the most recent example of judgment that appears compromised by factors unrelated to strategic business analysis." He opened a second folder, and Destiny's blood ran cold as she recognized the sophisticated surveillance that Paige Graham had orchestrated. Photographs of her and Mason leaving restaurants, timestamps documenting their after-hours meetings, and a detailed analysis of corporate decisions made during the timeline of their developing relationship. The correlation between Mr. Rhodes' personal entanglements and his increasingly sentimental approach to business decisions raises serious questions about whether emotion has replaced rational analysis in corporate leadership, Williams continued, his gaze moving meaningfully between Mason and Destiny. Questions that shareholders deserve to have answered before trusting their investments to leadership that may be distracted by personal considerations. The attack was surgical in its precision, designed to transform their love into evidence of professional incompetence without directly acknowledging the character assassination campaign that had created the crisis. Destiny felt fury rise in her chest like a tide, threatening to sweep away years of professional diplomatic training as she watched the man she loved being destroyed by people who'd weaponized his decency against him. But before she could formulate a response that would defend Mason without compromising their strategic position, Madeline Rhodes cleared her throat with the authority of someone who'd been waiting for her moment to seize control of the narrative. "If I may," Madeline said, rising from her seat with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to having rooms rearrange themselves around her presence. "As someone who's invested 44 years in Mason's development, I believe I can provide perspective on these concerns about judgment and decision-making." Mason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Destiny realized they were about to witness a mother sacrifice her son's happiness for what she considered his professional salvation. "Mason has always been passionate about social causes," Madeline continued, her voice carrying the kind of gentle disappointment that was more devastating than open criticism. "Even as a child, he insisted on giving his allowance to homeless shelters instead of saving for things he wanted. As a young man, he chose construction work over more suitable positions because he felt obligated to honor his father's memory through manual labor. The recitation of Mason's compassionate history was delivered as if kindness were a character flaw requiring management rather than a strength worth celebrating. Destiny could see board members nodding with understanding, recognizing the pattern Madeline was establishing. "These admirable qualities," Madeline said, and her tone made admirable sound like problematic, "have served him well in building corporate culture and employee loyalty. However, they also make him susceptible to influences that appeal to his emotional nature rather than his business acumen." The pause before "influences" was surgical in its precision, identifying Destiny as someone who'd exploited Mason's compassionate nature for her own purposes. Destiny felt the attack like a physical blow, recognizing the sophisticated cruelty of being painted as a manipulator who'd used his decency against him. "Mother," Mason said, and his voice carried warning that suggested he'd reached the limit of his tolerance for family intervention disguised as corporate concern. "My business decisions are based on comprehensive analysis of financial, strategic, and ethical factors. Personal relationships don't compromise that analysis, they inform it with perspectives that purely financial considerations miss." "Do they?" Williams interjected, consulting his surveillance materials with the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "Because the timeline suggests otherwise. Corporate decisions that prioritize employee welfare over profit maximization correlate precisely with the development of Mr. Rhodes' relationship with his assistant. Decisions that cost shareholders millions correlate with personal milestones that suggest emotional compromise of professional judgment." The evidence was circumstantial but damning, designed to make Mason's ethical leadership look like romantic weakness rather than principled strength. Destiny realized they were being destroyed by the same strategy used to discredit any leader who chose people over pure profit, the suggestion that kindness was a liability rather than an asset in corporate governance. But as Williams prepared to present his final arguments for removing Mason from operational control, as Madeline Rhodes positioned herself for what she clearly believed was an intervention that would save her son from himself, as Paige Graham watched with the satisfied attention of someone whose orchestrated destruction was proceeding according to plan, Mason Rhodes stood up. The movement was deliberate and commanding, projecting the kind of natural authority that had built corporate empires and inspired employee loyalty for 18 years. His steel-gray eyes swept the room with controlled intensity, cataloging allies and enemies with the precision of a battlefield strategist preparing for decisive action. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mason said, and his voice carried the resonant quality that made board members straighten in their chairs and reminded everyone present why they'd trusted him with billions of dollars in the first place. "You're absolutely right about one thing. My personal relationship with Destiny Lewis has affected my business decisions." Destiny felt her breath catch as she realized Mason was about to either vindicate or destroy himself with complete honesty about their relationship. Around the table, board members leaned forward with the attention of people witnessing either confession or defiance. "It's made me better at them," Mason continued, and his voice carried the conviction of someone who discovered an essential truth about the connection between personal happiness and professional excellence. "It's reminded me that sustainable business practices require understanding the human element in corporate strategy. That employee welfare isn't a cost center, it's a competitive advantage that creates loyalty, productivity, and long-term profitability that purely financial analysis misses." He moved to the presentation screen with movements that projected confidence despite the hostile environment, calling up data that Ben had prepared during their crisis strategy sessions. The Henderson construction workforce that Williams wants to reduce by 37% is currently exceeding productivity projections by 18%, Mason said, highlighting metrics that transformed the acquisition from costly sentiment into profitable strategy. Employee retention is at 94%, quality control ratings have improved by 23%, and client satisfaction scores are the highest in company history. Destiny watched board members processing the data, saw skepticism giving way to grudging interest as Mason demonstrated that ethical business practices weren't just morally superior but strategically advantageous. "These results aren't accidental," Mason continued, advancing to comparative analysis that showed Rhodes Enterprises outperforming competitors across multiple metrics. Companies that prioritize employee welfare consistently outperform companies that treat workers as disposable resources. Higher productivity, lower turnover costs, stronger client relationships, better community positioning, the financial benefits of ethical leadership compound over time in ways that quarterly profit maximization misses. Williams shifted uncomfortably in his seat, recognizing that his character assassination was being transformed into a masterclass on sustainable business practices. Mr. Rhodes, these short-term metrics don't address the fundamental concern about emotional decision-making. Don't they? Mason interrupted, and there was steel in his voice that reminded everyone present why he'd never lost a hostile takeover battle. Because emotional decision-making would be choosing immediate cost savings over long-term sustainability. Emotional decision-making would be sacrificing employee loyalty for quarterly earnings that look good to investors who don't understand the connection between workforce stability and competitive advantage. He turned away from the presentation screen to face the room directly, and Destiny could see something shifting in his expression, some final wall dissolving as he chose complete authenticity over protective armor. But there's something else you need to understand about my relationship with Destiny Lewis, Mason said, and his gaze found hers across the room with intensity that made her pulse quicken despite the corporate battlefield surrounding them. It hasn't compromised my judgment, it's clarified my understanding of what success actually means. The silence that followed was profound and charged with implications that extended beyond corporate governance into fundamental questions about the relationship between personal fulfillment and professional achievement. For 18 years, I've built this company as a monument to my father's memory, proving that ethical business practices could succeed where exploitation had failed. But I built it alone, surrounded by people who worked for me rather than with me, isolated by the armor I thought I needed to survive in a world that punishes vulnerability. Mason moved toward Destiny with deliberate steps that commanded attention from every person in the room, his steel-gray eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity. Destiny Lewis didn't compromise my business judgment, he said, and his voice carried the kind of certainty that had convinced investors to trust him with billions of dollars. She reminded me that the best leaders aren't those who sacrifice everything for corporate success, but those who understand that personal integrity and professional excellence are inseparable. That sustainable business practices require leaders who remember why human dignity matters more than quarterly earnings. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his eyes and feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the expensive suit that armored him for corporate warfare. She made me remember that my father didn't sacrifice himself for business success, he sacrificed himself for the belief that work should elevate human dignity rather than exploiting it. That the measure of a man's character isn't how much money he accumulates, but how he treats people who depend on him for their livelihoods. Mason reached out and took her hands in his, the gesture intimate and public and absolutely inappropriate for a corporate boardroom. Destiny felt her breath catch as she realized he was choosing her over professional safety, choosing authenticity over armor, choosing love over the careful isolation that had protected him for 18 years. Destiny Lewis has made me a better leader because she's made me a better man, Mason said, and his voice carried across the silent boardroom with the resonance of someone speaking fundamental truth. She's reminded me that strength doesn't come from emotional isolation but from having something worth protecting. That the best business decisions are made by leaders who understand the human cost of corporate strategy because they have people in their lives who matter more than profit margins. Williams started to object, started to point out that personal declarations were irrelevant to questions of corporate governance, but Mason's voice cut through the interruption with authority that brooked no opposition. So yes, Mason said, his gaze never leaving Destiny's face, my relationship with Destiny Lewis has affected my business decisions. It's made me unwilling to sacrifice employee welfare for shareholder appeasement. It's made me insist on sustainable practices over short-term profit maximization. It's made me choose long-term competitive advantage over quarterly earnings manipulation. He lifted their joined hands, displaying their connection for the entire room to witness and judge. And if that's the kind of emotional compromise that concerns this board, if that's the kind of judgment you consider unsuitable for corporate leadership, then you're welcome to find a CEO who's willing to treat human beings like line items on a balance sheet. The challenge hung in the air like electricity before a storm, and Destiny could feel the shift in atmospheric pressure as board members processed what they'd just witnessed. Mason Rhodes, the corporate emperor who'd built his empire on controlled authority and strategic intimidation, had just declared his love publicly and dared his board to punish him for choosing happiness over isolation. Madeline Rhodes stood from her seat with movements that projected disappointed authority, her pale blue eyes fixed on her son with the kind of maternal displeasure that had probably shaped his childhood. "Mason," she said, and her voice carried the tone of someone delivering unwelcome truths for the recipient's own good, "you're destroying everything you've worked to build for someone who can't possibly understand the responsibilities that come with your position. This infatuation is making you weak, making you vulnerable to people who would exploit your emotions for their own advancement." The accusation was delivered with surgical precision, designed to make Destiny look like a gold digger who'd manipulated Mason's compassionate nature for personal gain. But instead of weakening under maternal disapproval, Mason's expression hardened with something that looked like protective fury. "Mother," he said, and there was finality in his voice that suggested 18 years of careful deference was ending in this moment, "Destiny Lewis has never asked me for anything except the opportunity to prove her professional competence. She's never exploited my feelings or used our relationship for personal advancement. She's never demanded that I choose between loving her and maintaining my principles." He turned to face the room, his stance protective as he positioned himself between Destiny and the hostile forces arrayed against them. "Unlike some people in this room, she's never tried to use emotional manipulation to control my business decisions. She's never suggested that my capacity for love makes me unsuitable for leadership. She's never implied that personal happiness and professional excellence are mutually exclusive." The rebuke was delivered with the controlled force of someone who'd finally reached his limit with family members who wielded love like a weapon designed to ensure compliance rather than supporting authentic growth. Williams cleared his throat with the officious authority of someone attempting to regain control of proceedings that had spiraled beyond his orchestrated script. "Mr. Rhodes, while your personal declarations are touching, they don't address the fundamental concerns about fiduciary responsibility to shareholders who've invested in Rhodes Enterprises based on expectations of profit maximization rather than social welfare programming." Mason's smile was sharp and predatory, the expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this opening to demonstrate why his opponents had underestimated both his strategic intelligence and his commitment to ethical leadership. "Actually, Williams, they address exactly that concern," Mason said, returning to the presentation screen with movements that projected renewed confidence. "Because the shareholders who've invested in Rhodes Enterprises have seen consistent returns that outperform industry averages precisely because we prioritize sustainable practices over short-term profit maximization." He called up comprehensive performance data that transformed the meeting from character assassination into strategic analysis, displaying 5-year growth projections that made Williams' accusations look short-sighted rather than financially prudent. "Companies that treat employees as valuable assets rather than disposable resources show superior long-term performance across every metric that matters to serious investors," Mason continued, highlighting comparative data that supported his approach to ethical leadership. "Lower turnover costs, higher productivity rates, stronger client relationships, better community positioning, enhanced reputation management, the financial benefits compound annually in ways that quarterly cost-cutting never achieves." Board members leaned forward with renewed attention, recognizing that Mason was presenting strategic arguments rather than emotional appeals, demonstrating that ethical business practices were profitable rather than costly. "The Henderson Construction acquisition isn't an example of compromised judgment," Mason said, advancing to projections that showed the long-term financial impact of maintaining their workforce. "It's an example of strategic thinking that prioritizes sustainable competitive advantage over immediate cost savings." 18 months from now, when their productivity and client satisfaction ratings have generated increased market share and premium pricing opportunities, the board will understand why ethical leadership creates value rather than destroying it. Williams opened his mouth to object, to point out that 18-month projections were speculative rather than guaranteed, but Mason's presentation continued with the relentless precision of someone who'd spent decades defending principled decisions against short-sighted criticism. And yes, Mason said, his gaze finding destinies across the room with intensity that made her pulse quicken despite the corporate battlefield surrounding them, my relationship with Destiny Lewis has informed these strategic decisions. Because leaders who understand the human cost of corporate strategy make better decisions about sustainable business practices. Because executives who have people in their lives worth protecting are more committed to building companies that enhance rather than exploit human dignity. He moved toward her again, drawn by magnetic pull that seemed beyond conscious control, his steel-gray eyes holding hers with unwavering certainty. Destiny Lewis has made me a better CEO because she's reminded me why this company exists, Mason said, and his voice carried across the silent boardroom with the resonance of someone speaking fundamental truth. Not to generate abstract returns for faceless shareholders, but to prove that business success and human decency aren't mutually exclusive. That sustainable competitive advantage comes from treating people as valuable assets rather than disposable resources. When he reached her, when he framed her face with hands that trembled slightly with emotion despite his controlled public presentation, Destiny felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with corporate strategy and everything to do with the recognition that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the professional consequences. "I love you," Mason said, loud enough for the entire boardroom to hear, direct enough to eliminate any question about his priorities. "I love your integrity, your courage, your refusal to compromise your principles for convenience or profit. I love that you've made me remember why ethical leadership matters more than quarterly earnings. And if this board considers that a disqualifying weakness rather than essential strength, then they're welcome to find a CEO who's willing to sacrifice human dignity for shareholder appeasement." The declaration hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds. The corporate empire that had defined Mason's identity for 18 years, and the possibility of building something new that didn't require choosing between professional success and personal authenticity. Before anyone could respond, before Williams could object or Madeline could intervene or Paige could calculate the implications for her orchestrated destruction, Destiny went up on her toes and kissed Mason with the kind of passionate conviction that transformed a corporate boardroom into a stage for love's triumph over fear. When they broke apart, both breathing harder than the kiss warranted, the room remained silent except for the soft sound of Paige Graham gathering her materials with movements that suggested her services were no longer required. "Well," said board member Patricia Chen, breaking the silence with dry amusement, "I think we can safely say that Mr. Rhodes' commitment to his principles, both personal and professional, is not in question." The vote, when it came, was closer than Mason's enemies had hoped and more decisive than his supporters had dared expect. 7 votes for continued confidence in his leadership, 4 votes for implementing oversight committees, 1 abstention from Madeline Rhodes who apparently couldn't bring herself to vote against her son despite her disapproval of his choices. After the board meeting, the 3 antagonists found themselves alone in the empty conference room. "Well," Paige said, gathering her materials with rueful efficiency. "That didn't go according to anyone's plan." Williams loosened his tie, looking older than his 60 years. "He made us look like dinosaurs afraid of evolution." Madeline remained seated, studying her son through the glass wall as he celebrated with Destiny. "Perhaps we were. Perhaps we've been so focused on protecting what we thought mattered that we forgot to consider what actually does." Paige paused in her packing. "He proved something today that none of us believed possible, that strength and vulnerability aren't mutually exclusive. That principled leadership can survive corporate warfare," Williams added grudgingly. "That love enhances rather than diminishes capability," Madeline whispered, watching Mason's genuine smile. "Something I should have learned from his father instead of fearing it." They sat in contemplative silence, 3 intelligent people confronting the possibility that their protective instincts had been wrong, that the very qualities they tried to shield Mason from might be the source of his greatest strength. Chapter 9. The rooftop garden atop Rhodes Tower had been Mason's secret sanctuary for 12 years, a private oasis where the corporate emperor could shed his armor and remember what it felt like to nurture something beautiful instead of merely profitable. Hidden 52 floors above Manhattan's relentless ambition, the space bloomed with carefully tended roses, jasmine that perfumed the evening air, and herb gardens that spoke of someone who understood the therapeutic value of working with his hands in soil that demanded patience rather than quarterly returns. Now, 6 hours after the boardroom confrontation that had saved his empire and claimed their love publicly, Mason led Destiny through the glass doors that separated corporate warfare from natural sanctuary, his fingers intertwined with hers in a gesture that no longer required hiding or professional justification. "I can't believe you've had this up here all these years," Destiny said, her voice carrying wonder as she absorbed the unexpected beauty of the rooftop paradise. String lights that Mason had installed himself created gentle illumination among flowering vines, comfortable seating areas were positioned to take advantage of panoramic city views, and the scent of blooming jasmine mixed with evening air to create atmosphere that felt more like romantic fantasy than corporate reality. "I built it the year after I acquired the building," Mason replied, guiding her toward a stone bench positioned beneath a pergola heavy with climbing roses. "I told myself it was for stress management and air quality improvement, but honestly, I think I needed somewhere that felt alive in a world that sometimes felt like beautiful death." The admission carried weight that had nothing to do with gardening and everything to do with a man who'd spent 18 years building walls against loneliness so effective he'd almost forgotten what connection felt like. Destiny settled beside him on the bench, close enough to feel the warmth radiating through his dress shirt and smell the faint scent of his cologne mixing with jasmine blossoms. "It's beautiful," she said, studying his profile as he gazed out over the city lights that glittered like fallen stars across Manhattan's landscape. "It's also completely at odds with your reputation as the heartless billionaire who never shows weakness." Mason's laugh was soft and real, the sound of someone who'd finally given up pretending to be anything other than completely human. "Everything about today has been at odds with that reputation. Standing up in a boardroom full of corporate predators and declaring my love for my assistant probably wasn't covered in any leadership manual I've read." "Former assistant," Destiny corrected, and her voice carried satisfaction that made Mason turn to study her expression with growing intensity. "I believe your exact words were strategic partner and co-presenter. Hard to maintain professional boundaries when you've publicly claimed someone as your equal in front of the entire board." The reminder of his boardroom declaration sent heat coursing through Mason's steel-gray eyes, and Destiny felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the shift from post-victory contentment to something deeper and more immediate. They'd survived corporate warfare, proven that ethical leadership was strategically superior to ruthless alternatives, and demonstrated that love enhanced rather than compromised professional judgment. Now, in the privacy of his secret garden with the city sprawling below them like a conquered kingdom, they could finally explore what it meant to love each other without fear of professional consequences. "Destiny," Mason said, and her name on his lips carried the kind of reverent hunger that made her remember exactly how it had felt to be cherished by him in the intimate darkness of his penthouse bedroom. "Do you understand what you've done? What you've given me?" Before she could formulate an answer that encompassed everything from strategic partnership to emotional healing, Mason's hands framed her face with the gentle reverence that never failed to make her feel precious beyond measure. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones, his steel-gray eyes searched her expression with intensity that suggested he was memorizing details for safekeeping. "You've given me back my father's dream," he said quietly, and his voice carried the weight of 18 years spent fighting to honor memory while building empire. "The belief that business success and human decency aren't mutually exclusive. That sustainable competitive advantage comes from treating people as valuable assets rather than disposable resources." Destiny leaned into his touch, feeling the calluses on his palms that spoke of construction work performed decades before he'd learned to build with strategy instead of hammers. "You never lost that dream, Mason. You just learned to protect it behind armor that became so convincing even you sometimes forgot what it was defending." "I forgot until you reminded me," Mason replied, and his voice carried the kind of wonder that suggested he still couldn't quite believe she was real, couldn't quite accept that someone had chosen to see his complicated morality as strength rather than weakness. Until you stood in my office that first night and defended my character to my face when you had no reason to trust that the defense was deserved. The memory of that evening, finding him working alone, witnessing his hidden kindness with Mrs. Banks, feeling the electric awareness that had sparked between them despite every professional boundary designed to prevent such connections, felt like scenes from someone else's life. The woman who'd been terrified of depending on anyone, who'd armored herself against abandonment through careful self-reliance, seemed like a stranger compared to the person who'd stood beside Mason in hostile boardrooms and chosen partnership over self-protection. I trusted my instincts, Destiny said, reaching up to trace the strong line of his jaw with fingers that remembered how he'd responded to her touch with reverent hunger. I trusted what I saw when you thought no one was watching. I trusted that someone who fought for Henderson's workers in private was worth fighting for in public. Mason's mouth found hers with the controlled passion of someone who'd spent hours restraining desire in professional settings and could finally express the full depth of his feelings without fear of consequences. This kiss was different from their previous moments of connection, deeper, more urgent, carrying the weight of victory and the promise of future intimacy that no longer required hiding behind corporate courtesy. When they broke apart, both breathing harder than the soft kiss warranted, Mason rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes as if he were memorizing the moment for safekeeping. "I love you," he said, and the words carried none of the careful control he'd maintained during public declarations, all of the raw emotion he'd learned to suppress in corporate settings. "I love your courage, your integrity, your refusal to compromise your principles for convenience. I love that you've made me remember why power should serve purpose rather than ego." "I love you too," Destiny whispered back, and her voice carried years of careful self-protection dissolving in the face of complete emotional surrender. "I love your hidden kindness, your willingness to fight for people who can't fight for themselves, your determination to prove that success doesn't require abandoning compassion." Mason's hands moved to the buttons of her blazer with movements that were both urgent and reverent, as if he were unwrapping something precious that he'd been waiting his entire life to discover. The corporate armor that had protected them through hostile boardrooms and media attacks seemed suddenly irrelevant in the intimate atmosphere of flowering vines and string lights that transformed the rooftop into something approaching paradise. "Are you sure about this?" Mason asked, his hands stilling on her clothing as he searched her expression for any sign of hesitation or doubt. "Because making love to you here, in this place that represents everything I've built, changes everything permanently. You become part of not just my personal life but my professional identity, my corporate legacy, the future I'm building with Rhodes Enterprises." In response, Destiny reached up and loosened his tie with movements that were deliberately slow and seductive, letting the expensive silk slide through her fingers as she held his gaze with unwavering certainty. "Mason," she said softly, "I became part of your professional identity the moment I stood beside you in that boardroom and helped you argue that ethical leadership is competitive advantage. I became part of your corporate legacy when I chose to fight for your principles instead of protecting my own career safety. And I became part of the future you're building the night you first trusted me with your vulnerabilities instead of hiding behind executive armor." Mason's response was a sound somewhere between prayer and possession as he captured her mouth again, this time with the unleashed passion of someone who'd finally given up pretending that love was weakness rather than strength. His hands moved over her body with growing confidence, mapping territories that belonged to him now by right of mutual surrender and public declaration. The evening air was soft against Destiny's skin as Mason helped her out of the blazer that had armored her through corporate warfare, his touch reverent as he explored the curves and shadows revealed beneath professional clothing. The scent of jasmine blossoms mixed with his cologne to create an intoxicating atmosphere that made rational thought impossible and emotional connection inevitable. "You're beautiful," Mason said quietly, and his voice carried the kind of awe that suggested he couldn't quite believe she was real, couldn't quite accept that someone like her had chosen someone like him despite all the complications and consequences. "Inside and out, Destiny. You're beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with physical perfection and everything to do with the courage and integrity that make you unlike anyone I've ever known." "So are you," Destiny replied, her hands working on the buttons of his shirt with movements that were both curious and possessive, revealing the strong chest and shoulders that spoke of construction work performed decades before he'd learned to build empires with strategy instead of manual labor. Beautiful in ways that transcend expensive suits and corporate authority. Beautiful because you've spent 18 years proving that power doesn't have to corrupt, that success doesn't require sacrificing decency. When Mason lifted her into his arms with the easy strength of someone who'd built his empire with his hands before he'd ruled it with his mind, when he carried her to the cushioned seating area beneath string lights that cast gentle shadows across flowering vines, Destiny felt something settling into place that had nothing to do with physical desire and everything to do with emotional completion. The city lights glittered below them like fallen stars, the evening air carried the perfume of blooming gardens, and somewhere in the distance, the soft sounds of Manhattan's evening rhythm provided soundtrack for intimacy that felt both urgent and eternal. Mason's hands moved over her body with the reverent attention of someone exploring sacred territory. His mouth found the sensitive places along her throat and collarbone that made her arch against him with soft sounds of pleasure and need. "I want you to know," Mason said against her skin, his voice rough with desire and something deeper that might have been gratitude, "that everything about this moment feels like coming home. Like finally understanding what I've been searching for without knowing it." Instead of responding with words, Destiny pulled him down to her, claiming his mouth with hungry kisses that tasted of victory and promise and the kind of love that could weather whatever storms the future might bring. Their bodies moved together with increasing urgency, hands exploring, clothing disappearing, boundaries dissolving until there was nothing between them but warm skin and whispered endearments and the fundamental recognition that some connections were worth whatever professional risks they created. When Mason entered her with the controlled passion of someone who'd learned to balance strength with tenderness, when they moved together in rhythm that spoke of perfect compatibility and mutual surrender, Destiny understood why poets wrote about physical love as a form of prayer. Because this wasn't just about desire or attraction or the simple pleasure of human connection, this was about two people who'd learned to armor their hearts, discovering that the strongest protection came not from walls but from having someone worth being vulnerable with. "I love you," Mason whispered against her ear as they moved together toward completion that was as much emotional as physical. "I love you for seeing past the reputation to who I actually am underneath all the corporate armor. I love you for making me remember that strength comes from connection rather than isolation." "I love you too," Destiny replied, her voice breaking with the intensity of sensation and emotion that was too complex for rational analysis. "I love you for choosing to trust me with your real self instead of hiding behind executive personas. I love you for proving that some battles are worth fighting regardless of the professional consequences." When release claimed them both, when their bodies arched together in perfect synchronization toward satisfaction that left them breathless and shaking, Destiny felt the profound peace that came from knowing she'd found someone who understood both her strength and her scars, someone who enhanced rather than diminished her capacity for courage and compassion. Afterward, as they lay tangled together beneath string lights and flowering vines, as Mason's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder and her head rested in the hollow of his throat where she could feel his heartbeat gradually returning to normal, Destiny felt something settling into place that had nothing to do with physical satisfaction and everything to do with emotional completion. "No regrets?" Mason asked quietly, and she could hear the echo of post-intimate uncertainty that had followed their first night together, the fear of someone who'd learned that things he treasured could be destroyed by forces beyond his control. "Only regret that we waited so long to stop hiding from each other," Destiny replied, pressing a soft kiss to the spot where his pulse beat steady and strong beneath warm skin. "Only gratitude that we found the courage to fight for something real instead of settling for professional safety." Mason's arms tightened around her, and she could feel something settling in him too, some final piece of armor dissolving in the face of complete acceptance and unconditional partnership. "Destiny," he said into the jasmine-scented darkness, "I want you to know that whatever the future brings, whatever challenges Rhodes Enterprises faces, whatever new battles we have to fight together, this moment represents everything I've been searching for without knowing it. You've given me back not just my father's dream of ethical business practices, but the possibility of building something that matters with someone who understands why it matters." As they dressed slowly in the intimate aftermath of lovemaking, as they prepared to return to the corporate world that had tested their connection and found it unbreakable, Mason's phone buzzed with a message that made him smile with genuine pleasure for the first time in days. "Ben," he explained, reading the text with satisfaction that suggested good news after days of crisis management. The Henderson construction story has been picked up by 3 business publications as an example of innovative leadership practices that prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term profit maximization. Our stock price is up 4% in after-hours trading, and he's fielded 6 calls from reporters wanting interviews about ethical business strategies. Destiny felt warm satisfaction settle in her chest as she realized that their boardroom victory had created ripple effects that extended beyond Rhodes Enterprises into broader conversations about the relationship between corporate responsibility and competitive advantage. So the business world is finally ready to consider that treating employees as valuable assets might actually be profitable strategy instead of costly sentiment? She asked, straightening Mason's tie with movements that were both practical and affectionate. "Some of it," Mason replied, his steel-gray eyes holding hers with intensity that suggested he was seeing not just their personal future but professional possibilities that could transform entire industries. "And with your strategic insights and nonprofit experience informing our approach to sustainable business practices, we might be able to prove that ethical leadership isn't just morally superior, it's the future of competitive advantage." As they prepared to leave the rooftop sanctuary that had witnessed their complete emotional and physical surrender, as they faced the prospect of building something together that honored both their professional expertise and their personal connection, Destiny felt the quiet certainty that came from knowing they'd survived every test corporate warfare could devise. But their private celebration was interrupted by the soft sound of elevator doors opening, and they turned to see a figure emerging onto the rooftop with movements that projected determination mixed with uncertainty. Denisha Lewis, 23 years old and carrying the kind of nervous energy that suggested she'd been building courage for this moment, stepped into the garden with expressions that held both pride and apprehension. "Mom," she called softly, and her voice carried the musical quality that reminded Destiny of her own mother, mixed with strength that was purely her daughter's own development. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, but Uncle Devin told me about what happened in the board meeting today, and I wanted to meet the man who's made you happy enough to hum love songs at dawn." Destiny felt her breath catch as she realized her daughter had somehow gained access to Rhodes Tower's executive floors after business hours, had navigated security systems and elevator restrictions to reach the rooftop garden where she'd witnessed enough to understand that something significant had shifted in her mother's life. "Denisha," Destiny said, moving toward her daughter with movements that were both welcoming and slightly panicked, "how did you get up here?" "I may be unemployed, but I'm not helpless," Denisha replied with the gentle confidence that had carried her through college and sustained her through 8 months of post-graduation job searching. "I told building security I was delivering important documents to Mr. Rhodes' assistant, and they directed me to the executive floor. Ben Shaw was still working late, and when I explained who I was, he said you and Mr. Rhodes were celebrating strategic victories in the garden, and that I should probably see for myself why my mother has been glowing like a teenager with her first crush." Mason stepped forward with movements that projected both authority and respect, extending his hand to Denisha with the kind of formal courtesy that suggested he understood the significance of this meeting. "Ms. Lewis," he said, and his voice carried the measured warmth of someone who knew that earning a daughter's approval was more important than convincing board members or impressing investors. "I'm Mason Rhodes. I've heard wonderful things about your intelligence and integrity from your mother." Denisha studied him with the frank assessment of someone who'd learned to protect her mother from potential threats, her brown eyes, so similar to Destiny's, cataloging details with the precision of someone evaluating whether this man was worthy of her family's trust. "Mr. Rhodes," she replied, accepting his handshake with firm pressure that suggested she'd inherited both her mother's strength and her uncle's protective instincts. "I've heard some interesting things about your approach to corporate leadership from the business news coverage. Also from watching my mother transform from stressed and exhausted to happy and confident over the past 3 weeks." The observation was delivered with the kind of diplomatic directness that suggested Denisha had inherited her mother's ability to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics while maintaining authentic communication. Your mother has had a similar effect on my life, Mason replied, and his honesty was both disarming and reassuring. She's reminded me that business success and personal integrity don't have to be mutually exclusive, that the best leaders are those who understand the human element in corporate strategy. Denisha's expression softened slightly, and Destiny could see her daughter processing the genuine affection in Mason's voice, the way his attention remained focused on her despite the obvious importance of their conversation. "Mom's told me about your ethical approach to business practices," Denisha said, and her tone carried grudging respect mixed with continued wariness. "She's also mentioned that your relationship has created some professional complications that could affect both your careers." The comment revealed how much Destiny had shared about the corporate warfare they'd been navigating, and Mason felt something warm settle in his chest at the evidence that she'd trusted her daughter with the truth about their relationship's complexity. "It has," Mason agreed, and his directness seemed to surprise Denisha, who'd probably expected diplomatic evasions rather than honest acknowledgement. "Loving your mother has meant choosing principles over convenience, fighting for ethical leadership when surrender would have been professionally safer. But it's also meant discovering that some things are worth whatever professional risks they create." "Such as?" Denisha's question carried the protective challenge of someone who'd watched her mother be abandoned by people who claimed to love her when love became inconvenient. Mason's gaze found Destiny's across the garden, and she could see him drawing strength from their connection as he prepared to answer the question that would determine whether her daughter accepted him as worthy of their family's trust. "Such as the possibility of building something together that proves business success and human decency aren't mutually exclusive," Mason said, his voice carrying the conviction that had convinced board members and inspired employee loyalty for 18 years. "Such as demonstrating that sustainable competitive advantage comes from treating people as valuable assets rather than disposable resources. Such as creating a legacy that honors both your mother's commitment to social justice and my father's belief that work should elevate human dignity." Denisha was quiet for a long moment, and Destiny could see her daughter weighing Mason's words against years of watching her mother choose integrity over convenience, principles over personal safety. "Mr. Rhodes," Denisha said finally, and her voice carried the kind of measured authority that suggested she'd inherited both parents' strength despite being raised by only one, "I need you to understand something about my mother. She's spent 23 years putting my needs before her own happiness, building a career that mattered more than one that paid well, choosing the hard right over the easy wrong even when it cost her personally." Mason nodded, recognizing the protective speech that any good daughter would deliver to someone who wanted to claim a place in her mother's life. "She deserves someone who understands that her strength isn't something to be managed or controlled, but something to be celebrated and supported," Denisha continued, and her voice carried the musical quality that reminded Mason of Destiny's laugh mixed with steel that was purely her own development. "She deserves someone who enhances her capacity for courage rather than asking her to diminish it for the sake of convenience or social acceptance." "Your mother has never needed anyone to manage her strength," Mason replied, and his voice carried admiration that was both professional and deeply personal. "She's needed someone who's strong enough to stand beside her when she fights for what's right, intelligent enough to appreciate her strategic insights, and secure enough to celebrate her successes without feeling threatened by her competence." The answer seemed to satisfy something in Denisha's protective assessment, and Destiny watched her daughter's expression soften as she recognized that Mason's feelings for her mother were based on respect rather than possession, partnership rather than control. "Good," Denisha said simply. "Because anyone who underestimates Destiny Lewis discovers very quickly that she's capable of achieving things they never thought possible. And anyone who tries to limit her capabilities for their own comfort discovers that she's also capable of walking away from situations that don't serve her growth." "I'm counting on her capabilities," Mason replied, and his smile was soft and real and completely at odds with his intimidating corporate reputation. "I'm counting on her strategic insights to help transform Rhodes Enterprises into a model for ethical business practices. I'm counting on her integrity to keep me focused on sustainable leadership rather than short-term profit maximization. And I'm counting on her courage to help me build something that proves business success and human decency are not just compatible but inseparable." As the three of them stood together in the rooftop garden, surrounded by flowering vines and string lights that cast gentle shadows across their faces. Destiny felt the profound satisfaction that came from watching the two people she loved most in the world recognize each other's worth and choose mutual respect over protective suspicion. "Welcome to the family, Mr. Rhodes," Denisha said, extending her hand again with a smile that transformed her entire face and reminded Mason powerfully of her mother's radiant joy. "I hope you're prepared for Sunday dinners with Uncle Devin, because he's going to want to conduct his own interview about your intentions regarding my mother's happiness." Mason's laugh was genuine and slightly nervous, the sound of someone who'd conquered corporate boardrooms but was appropriately intimidated by the prospect of earning approval from a protective police detective who'd spent decades keeping his sister safe from people who might hurt her. "I'm prepared for whatever interviews your family considers necessary," Mason replied, and his voice carried the kind of determination that had built empires from construction site ambitions. "Your mother is worth whatever scrutiny comes with claiming a place in her life." As they prepared to leave the rooftop sanctuary that had witnessed love's triumph over fear, as they faced the future with the confidence that came from surviving every test corporate warfare could devise and emerging stronger rather than broken, Destiny felt the quiet certainty that some risks were worth taking regardless of the potential consequences. Because some things, integrity, courage, and the love between people who'd learned to fight for each other instead of hiding from vulnerability, created foundations strong enough to support whatever future they chose to build together. Chapter 10. 3 months later, Destiny stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of what had once been Mason's solitary office, watching autumn paint Manhattan in shades of gold and amber while reviewing strategic plans that would transform Rhodes Enterprises from successful corporation into industry model for sustainable business practices. The space had been redesigned to accommodate 2 executive desks positioned to encourage collaboration rather than hierarchy, comfortable seating areas for the extended strategy sessions that had become their trademark approach to complex problem-solving, and walls lined with awards recognizing their innovative leadership in corporate responsibility. The changes reflected more than mere office renovation. They represented a fundamental transformation in how business could be conducted when leaders understood that sustainable competitive advantage came from treating people as valuable assets rather than disposable resources. "The Henderson construction integration exceeded every projection we made during that infamous board meeting," Mason said, entering the office with coffee and the kind of satisfied expression that suggested he'd just finished a meeting that had validated everything they'd fought to prove. "Productivity up 23%. Client satisfaction ratings the highest in company history, employee retention at 98%. Williams actually admitted that maintaining their workforce was strategically sound instead of sentimental business practice." Destiny accepted the coffee with a smile that carried both personal affection and professional pride, noting how Mason's steel-gray eyes held warmth that had been absent during their early professional interactions. The corporate armor he'd worn for 18 years had been replaced by authentic confidence that came from leading with integrity rather than intimidation, from building success that enhanced rather than exploited human dignity. "Any word on the Hartford manufacturing acquisition?" she asked, settling into the collaborative workspace they designed to encourage the kind of strategic partnership that had transformed Rhodes Enterprises into something approaching her father's original vision of ethical business practices. "Board approved the proposal unanimously," Mason replied, and his voice carried satisfaction that went beyond mere corporate victory. "Full workforce retention, enhanced safety protocols, profit-sharing programs that distribute success instead of concentrating it. Even the most conservative board members are starting to understand that ethical leadership generates returns that short-term profit maximization can't match." The Hartford manufacturing acquisition represented their 5th successful integration using principles that prioritized employee welfare alongside shareholder value, proving repeatedly that sustainable business practices were profitable rather than costly, strategically superior rather than sentimentally misguided. So the business world is finally ready to admit that treating employees as human beings might actually be good for the bottom line? Destiny asked, though she already knew the answer from the flood of consulting requests they'd received from corporations wanting to implement similar approaches to ethical leadership. "Some of it," Mason agreed, moving to stand beside her at the windows that overlooked the city where they'd fought and won battles that had seemed impossible just months earlier. "The smart ones, anyway." The ones who understand that sustainable competitive advantage requires thinking beyond quarterly earnings to generational impact. As they stood together watching Manhattan's afternoon rhythm, Destiny reflected on the journey that had brought them from professional wariness to personal partnership to the kind of collaboration that was reshaping entire industries. The warnings about the heartless billionaire seemed like stories told about different people entirely, fairy tales designed to keep cautious hearts from discovering the wounded man behind the corporate reputation. "Devon called this morning," Destiny said, leaning into Mason's warmth as his arms settled around her waist with the natural ease of people who'd learned to support each other through whatever challenges arose. "He wanted to remind you about Sunday dinner and mentioned something about bringing preliminary background checks on the engagement ring designers you've been researching." Mason's laugh was genuine and slightly nervous, the sound of someone who'd conquered corporate boardrooms but remained appropriately intimidated by the prospect of earning continued approval from a protective police detective who'd spent decades keeping his sister safe from people who might hurt her. "Your brother takes his protective responsibilities very seriously," Mason observed, though his tone carried affection rather than complaint. "He's interviewed my jeweler, my accountant, and my personal attorney about my long-term intentions regarding family financial security. I think he knows more about my assets than my financial advisor does. Devon wants to make sure that anyone who claims a permanent place in our family understands that we protect each other," Destiny replied, feeling warmth spread through her chest at the evidence that her brother had not only accepted Mason but claimed him as worthy of family protection. "He's also probably enjoying having someone to intimidate who's actually impressed by police detective credentials instead of dismissing them as irrelevant to corporate authority." "I have tremendous respect for police detective credentials," Mason said solemnly, though his eyes held amusement that suggested he'd grown genuinely fond of Devon's protective interrogations. "Especially when they belong to someone who's spent 23 years ensuring that the woman I love grew up strong enough to challenge billionaire CEOs and secure enough to demand the respect she deserves." Before Destiny could respond to the sentiment that never failed to make her pulse quicken with gratitude for being truly seen and valued, Ben Shaw knocked on their office door with the kind of diplomatic timing that suggested he'd been monitoring their conversation for an appropriate interruption point. "Sorry to interrupt," Ben said, entering with tablet in hand and expression that suggested he was delivering particularly welcome news, "but Denisha's here for your lunch meeting, and she brought what she described as employment celebration materials that require immediate attention." Destiny felt her breath catch with anticipation as she realized her daughter had finally received the job offer they'd all been hoping for during 8 months of post-graduation career searching. Denisha had been interviewing with non-profit organizations across the city, seeking positions that would allow her to combine her social work education with her natural leadership abilities in ways that served communities rather than merely generating income. "Send her in," Mason said immediately, and Destiny could see him shifting into the kind of supportive mode that had made her family claim him as worthy of their trust and affection. Denisha Lewis entered the office with the kind of radiant energy that suggested excellent news barely contained, carrying a bouquet of flowers and wearing the professional attire that indicated she'd come directly from what had apparently been a successful final interview. "Mom, Mason," she said, and her voice carried musical excitement that reminded Destiny powerfully of her own mother's joy during family celebrations, "I have news that requires immediate champagne and possibly dancing on expensive furniture." "You got the position with Community Partners?" Destiny asked, though she could already see the answer in her daughter's transformed expression. "Better," Denisha replied, setting down the flowers with movements that suggested she was barely restraining herself from literal jumping with excitement. "I got the position with Community Partners, and they're implementing a pilot program for comprehensive family services that's based on research I did about Mom's work at Community Forward. They want to test whether sustainable funding models can support the kind of holistic approach that actually solves problems instead of just managing symptoms." The announcement sent warmth flooding through Destiny's chest as she realized her daughter would have the opportunity to build the kind of programs she'd dreamed of creating, the comprehensive approaches to community development that addressed root causes rather than surface manifestations of systemic problems. "Denisha, that's wonderful," Mason said, and his voice carried genuine pride that had nothing to do with corporate courtesy and everything to do with family celebration. Community Partners has an excellent reputation for innovative social programming. You'll have the resources and support to create real change in people's lives. That's not even the best part, Denisha continued, moving to embrace both her mother and Mason with the kind of spontaneous affection that indicated he'd been fully claimed as family rather than tolerated as her mother's romantic choice. They're partnering with Rhodes Enterprises to develop workplace wellness programs that support employee families through comprehensive services. Community childcare, financial literacy education, job training for spouses, housing assistance for workers transitioning between positions, everything integrated to create stability that benefits both employees and employers. Destiny felt tears threaten behind her eyes as she realized the program represented everything she'd fought for at Community Forward, everything Mason had believed about the connection between employee welfare and sustainable business practices, everything their partnership had been working to prove about the compatibility between corporate success and social responsibility. So you'll be working with us to develop programs that demonstrate ethical business practices are profitable rather than costly? Mason asked, and Destiny could see him processing the implications for both family integration and corporate strategy. I'll be working with you to prove that companies who invest in comprehensive employee support create competitive advantages that short-term profit maximization can't match, Denisha corrected, and her voice carried the kind of confident authority that suggested she'd inherited both parents' strength and intelligence. I'll be helping to build the kind of workplace culture that treats families as valuable assets rather than inconvenient complications. As they celebrated with champagne that Ben had somehow procured during the brief time between announcement and toasting, as they planned strategy sessions that would integrate Denisha's nonprofit expertise with Rhodes Enterprises' corporate resources, as they discussed the possibility of creating industry models that other companies could replicate, Destiny felt the profound satisfaction that came from watching separate pieces of her life weave together into something larger and more meaningful than she'd dared to imagine. The afternoon passed in a blur of strategic planning and family celebration, interrupted only by phone calls from reporters wanting interviews about Rhodes Enterprises' approach to stakeholder capitalism and investors interested in funding similar programs at their own companies. By evening, as autumn light painted the office in shades of gold and amber, the three of them had outlined preliminary frameworks for programs that could transform not just individual companies but entire approaches to corporate responsibility. I have something for you, Mason said as they prepared to leave for dinner at a restaurant that had become their traditional celebration venue, reaching into his desk drawer with movements that suggested nervous anticipation mixed with hopeful certainty. Destiny felt her pulse quicken as she realized the significance of the moment. The way Mason's carefully controlled expression couldn't quite hide the vulnerability of someone about to risk everything on the assumption that she wanted the same future he'd been planning. Mason, she said softly, studying his expression for clues about whether this was the conversation they'd been approaching carefully for weeks, the discussion about permanent partnership that would make their professional collaboration legally as well as emotionally binding. Before I say anything official, Mason said, his voice carrying the kind of careful control that suggested he'd rehearsed this moment while trying to account for every possible response, I need you to know that this isn't about completing some conventional relationship timeline or satisfying social expectations about appropriate progression from professional partnership to personal commitment. He moved closer to her, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his steel-gray eyes and feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the expensive suit that had become his trademark approach to corporate authority. This is about wanting to build something permanent with someone who understands that love enhances strength instead of compromising it, Mason continued, reaching into his pocket with movements that made Destiny's breath catch with anticipation. About creating legal and financial partnerships that reflect the emotional and professional collaboration we've already established. About proving that some connections are worth whatever social or corporate complications they create. When he dropped to one knee in their shared office, when he opened the small velvet box that revealed a ring designed with elegant simplicity that somehow captured both strength and beauty, Destiny felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with romantic gestures and everything to do with the recognition that some partnerships were worth formalizing regardless of conventional timelines or social expectations. Destiny Lewis, Mason said, and her name on his lips sounded like promise and prayer and the beginning of something that would either heal them or complete them entirely. Will you marry me? Will you continue building Rhodes Enterprises into a model for ethical business practices? Will you help me prove that sustainable competitive advantage comes from treating people as valuable assets rather than disposable resources? The proposal was quintessentially Mason, practical and romantic in equal measure, acknowledging both their personal connection and their professional partnership, recognizing that their love had become inseparable from their shared commitment to transforming corporate culture. Yes, Destiny said, and her voice carried years of careful self-protection dissolving in the face of complete emotional surrender. Yes to marrying you, yes to building something together that proves business success and human decency aren't mutually exclusive, yes to creating the kind of partnership that honors both our professional expertise and our personal commitment. As Mason slipped the ring onto her finger with movements that were both reverent and triumphant, as Denisha erupted into celebration that included actual dancing on expensive furniture, as their shared office filled with the kind of joy that came from watching separate lives weave together into something larger and more meaningful than individual ambition, Destiny felt the quiet certainty that some risks were worth taking regardless of the potential consequences. "I love you," Mason said, pulling her into his arms with the easy strength of someone who'd finally learned that vulnerability was a form of courage rather than weakness. "I love your integrity, your intelligence, your refusal to compromise your principles for convenience or social acceptance. I love that you've made me remember why power should serve purpose rather than ego." "I love you too," Destiny replied, going up on her toes to claim his mouth with passionate conviction that transformed their corporate office into something approaching sacred space. "I love your hidden kindness, your determination to prove that success doesn't require abandoning compassion, your willingness to fight for people who can't fight for themselves." When they broke apart, both breathing harder than the kiss warranted, the room filled with applause from Ben Shaw and the handful of employees who'd apparently been monitoring developments with the investment of people whose own professional futures had been enhanced by witnessing ethical leadership in action. "So," Denisha said with the satisfied expression of someone whose protective assessment had been thoroughly vindicated, "when do we start planning a wedding that proves love stories can have happy endings even when they begin with warnings about heartless billionaires?" As evening settled over Manhattan, as they prepared to celebrate engagements and new jobs and the kind of professional partnerships that were reshaping entire industries, Destiny reflected on the journey that had brought them from wariness to trust to the kind of collaboration that created value for everyone involved. 6 months earlier, everyone had warned her not to work for the heartless billionaire whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him like winter chill. But she'd discovered that some warnings were meant to be ignored, that some reputations concealed rather than revealed character, that some risks led to rewards beyond anything conventional wisdom could predict. Mason Rhodes had never been heartless. He'd been protecting a heart wounded by early loss and corporate betrayal, armoring compassion behind intimidation designed to prevent exploitation of his fundamental decency. Destiny Lewis had never been just an executive assistant. She'd been a strategic partner waiting for someone strong enough to appreciate her insights and secure enough to celebrate her successes without feeling threatened by her competence. Together, they'd proven that ethical leadership was not just morally superior but strategically advantageous, that sustainable business practices created competitive advantages that short-term profit maximization couldn't match, that the best corporate cultures were built by leaders who understood the connection between employee welfare and sustainable success. But more than that, they'd demonstrated that love enhanced rather than compromised professional judgment, that personal happiness and corporate responsibility were not just compatible but inseparable, that some partnerships created value that neither person could achieve alone. Have you ever discovered that warnings about someone's character said more about others' fears than about that person's true nature? Have you found that the biggest professional risks sometimes lead to the most meaningful personal rewards? Share your stories about finding unexpected love in unlikely places. I love hearing how courage and authenticity create connections that transform not just individual lives but entire approaches to success and happiness. As they left Rhodes Tower together, as they walked through Manhattan streets transformed by autumn light and personal triumph, as they faced the future with confidence that came from surviving every test corporate warfare could devise and emerging stronger rather than broken, Destiny knew with bone-deep certainty that some things were worth fighting for regardless of who lined up in opposition. Love. Integrity. The courage to choose principles over convenience. The wisdom to understand that sustainable success required treating people as valuable assets rather than disposable resources. The recognition that some partnerships created foundations strong enough to support whatever dreams two people chose to build together. Everyone had warned her not to work for the heartless billionaire. But she'd found something infinitely more valuable than safety. She'd found unexpected love with someone who understood that the heart's greatest protection came not from walls but from having someone worth being vulnerable with. And that, she reflected as Mason's hand tightened around hers and autumn light painted their shared future in shades of gold and possibility, was worth every warning she'd ever ignored.